Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. The Forgotten Islands. It's easy to ignore the eerie whispers of the wind when you've spent months in a place as chaotic and vibrant as Miami. But there's something about this island, La Isla Perdida, that stirs something deeper inside of me. Perhaps it's the constant hum in the air, or the way the sea swells unpredictably as though it's hiding something beneath its surface. My name is Thomas, and I'm here to unravel a mystery that has been haunting this place for centuries. The island used to be home to local tribes, long since erased from the maps. History books mention nothing of it, and yet there are stories, old tales passed down by the few who remember the land's original inhabitants. I came here on a research grant, thinking I'd find a lost piece of history. Instead, I found something far darker. I had arrived at the island just 2 days ago, a bright, sunny morning that seemed ordinary enough. The locals in the nearby town of Miami were hesitant when I mentioned the island, their eyes darting nervously, as if they had all agreed on some unspoken rule to avoid it. I thought little of their warnings. After all, I'm a historian, not a superstitious traveler. But that first night, as I camped near the ruins of the old village, something strange happened. A cold wind blew through the trees, though the air was still and the sky cloudless. The sound of leaves rustling in the breeze shifted, not the usual soft whisper, but a deeper, rhythmic sound that echoed like footsteps. I stood up, trying to locate the source, but there was nothing. No one. Nothing but the sound of my heart beating faster. It was absurd to think it was someone else. No one had been on this island for decades. And yet, the sensation lingered, gnawing at me like a growing anxiety. By morning, I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, some unsettling mix of the island's isolation and my exhaustion from the trip. I ventured into the forest to gather more materials for my research. The deeper I went, the more I noticed the strange stillness in the air. There was no bird song, no insects buzzing, only silence. And then I saw them. The footprints. They were large, far too large for any animal I knew of. Their shape was more human, yet their depth suggested something heavy, something capable of causing the earth to tremble under its weight. As I followed them, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The deeper I went into the woods, the stronger the feeling became, an overwhelming sense that I was not alone. By the time I returned to my camp, dusk was falling, and with it, a strange fog rolled in from the sea. The air turned colder, heavier, as if something ancient was awakening beneath the island's surface. The trees loomed above me like silent sentinels, their shadows stretching unnaturally long across the ground. That night, I heard it again, the soft, rhythmic sound. This time, it wasn't just leaves rustling. I could hear the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps, getting closer. I froze in place, listening. The sound grew louder, as if something was circling my camp. My breath caught in my throat, my heart pounding in my ears. I grabbed the flashlight from my pack and shined it into the darkness. The beam sliced through the fog, illuminating nothing but the twisted trunks of trees. I stood still, waiting, but there was no movement, no figure, no sign of life. Just the oppressive silence that swallowed the island whole. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into the void, but eventually the footsteps faded away. The tension in my chest didn't. It only deepened. As I lay in my tent that night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept racing, replaying the events over and over. What were those sounds? What had I seen? Or had I just imagined it all? I tried to dismiss it, but deep down, something inside me knew that whatever was happening on this island was not natural. Tomorrow, I planned to visit the village ruins again to search for answers. But I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there were things here far older than the ruins, things that had never been meant to be disturbed. Little did I know, the island's ancient guardians were already awakening, and my presence here had not gone unnoticed. The next morning, the island felt different. It wasn't just the air, which still hung heavy and thick, or the silence that pressed against my ears. It was something in the ground beneath my feet, something in the way the trees stood as if watching me, waiting. I set off for the village ruins once more, trying to push aside the feeling that the island itself was slowly closing in on me. The fog hadn't lifted, still swirling low over the ground, clinging to the trees and rocks like a living thing. As I walked, I began to notice something odd. The footprints from the day before were still there. But now they were different. More like a trail leading deeper into the jungle. They weren't just human-shaped anymore. They were larger, more distorted, as if the creature they belonged to was evolving, becoming something other than what I had first seen. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to keep moving. I couldn't afford to stop now. I was so close. The ruins were just ahead, partially hidden by thick vines and moss. As I approached, the structure began to reveal itself, old stone foundations, broken walls, and shattered artifacts half buried in the earth. This was it, the last remnant of the ancient tribe that once inhabited the island. As I knelt to examine the ruins, I felt it, that sensation again. The unmistakable feeling of eyes on me. My hand froze over a cracked stone, and I glanced around. Nothing. Just then, I heard the sound. Soft at first, like a distant whisper, but quickly growing louder, the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the distance. This time, they were walking in a circle. They were moving towards me. I spun around, flashlight in hand, but once again, the beam cut through nothing but fog and trees. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I found myself inching backward, heart racing. Was it just the wind? Was it my imagination? Then I heard it again. Closer now, unmistakably real. The footsteps were no longer just a distant sound. They were coming from right behind me. I could almost feel the weight of whatever was moving through the underbrush. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't my mind. It was real. I turned and sprinted. The brush whipped past me, sharp twigs and branches clawing at my skin, but I couldn't stop. I had to get out. My instinct screamed at me to run, to escape, but the closer I got to the edge of the jungle, the more the ground seemed to shift beneath me, as though it were alive, twisting and turning in ways it shouldn't. I broke through the trees and into the clearing. My breath was ragged, my pulse pounding in my ears. But as I looked around, the world had changed. The village ruins were no longer in front of me. The land stretched out before me, but it was different. The buildings were gone. The stone foundations had disappeared, leaving behind only an eerie, empty void. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Had I imagined it all? The ruins? The footprints? The sound of footsteps stopped. Silence fell once again, thick and oppressive. But then, I saw something. A shadow, long and distorted, creeping out of the fog from the direction I had come. It wasn't the shape of a person, nor an animal. It was something far worse. A dark figure, its shape shifting and contorting in ways that made no sense. It moved like smoke, but I could feel it, the weight of it pressing down on the air, bending reality itself. It stopped just at the edge of the clearing, its eyes glowing faintly through the dark mist. They were wide and unblinking, reflecting a light that shouldn't have been there. For a moment, it simply stared at me, and I could hear its breath, slow and deliberate, as if it were savoring the fear it had instilled in me. I stumbled back, tripping over the uneven ground, but I couldn't look away. The creature didn't move. It didn't need to. It knew I was trapped. I ran. I don't know how far I got before I collapsed in the sand, gasping for air. My head spun, my thoughts a blur of confusion and fear. Was it real? Or had I finally lost my mind? But deep down, I knew the truth. Whatever had been awakened on this island, whatever had begun to stir, wasn't just a creature. It wasn't just a ghost or a shadow. It was something ancient, something tied to this land, to the spirits of those who had once called it home. And it wasn't going to let me leave. I spent the rest of the day in a haze, unsure of what was real and what was just a figment of my exhausted mind. I told myself over and over that I had to be imagining things, the shadows, the footsteps, the creature with glowing eyes. There had to be a rational explanation. But deep down, I knew that none of this made sense. I couldn't explain it. I didn't want to. The fog had thickened by the time I returned to my camp. The island felt colder now, the air heavier, as though the very atmosphere was pressing down on me. Every step I took seemed to echo louder than it should. The usual sounds, the calls of birds, the hum of insects, were absent. The silence was so complete that it seemed unnatural, almost suffocating. I tried to shake off the dread that clung to me like a second skin. I needed to focus. I needed to figure out what was happening, what had been awakened on this island. It was the only thing that kept me going. But every time I looked at the shadows stretching across the camp, my mind would race back to that figure, that creature, in the clearing. Night fell, and with it, the island seemed to come alive. Strange noises drifted through the trees, whispers, low murmurs, like voices carried on the wind. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel them. They crawled under my skin, sending chills down my spine. I wasn't alone. The tent felt smaller, more suffocating as I lay inside, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. I knew I had to sleep, but sleep seemed like a luxury I couldn't afford. Every creak, every rustle outside the tent made my heart race. The sounds of the island were changing, becoming more pronounced, more deliberate. I could hear the faintest scraping, like claws on stone. I sat up, the air thick with tension. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of the noises. Was it just the wind? Was it just the island settling, like an old house creaking in the dark? Then I heard it. A low, guttural sound. Not wind. Not an animal. A voice. My blood ran cold. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, closer. I couldn't make out the words, but it was unmistakably human, or something that had once been human. The voice was almost mournful, like a cry from deep within the earth, like a call from something ancient. I grabbed my flashlight and shoved the tent flap open, heart racing. I scanned the camp, the beam of light cutting through the fog, illuminating only the empty space around me. Nothing. No movement. No shadows. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Rationality was the only thing keeping me grounded now. It's just my mind playing tricks, I told myself. It's the isolation, the fear, the stress. That's all. But as the voice continued, so did the scratching. It was coming from behind me, from the direction of the old village ruins. I turned slowly, my hand trembling as I aimed the flashlight at the source of the sound. The beam flickered for a moment, and when it steadied, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. Fresh ones. The same large, distorted prints from the day before. But now they were deeper, as though whatever made them was far closer, far larger than I had initially thought. My breath caught in my throat. They led directly to my camp. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't wait for whatever it was to come for me. I grabbed my pack, my heart racing in my chest as I scrambled to gather my things. The voice was louder now, growing in intensity, though still impossible to understand. I glanced over my shoulder, but the fog was too thick, the darkness too consuming. I stepped into the forest, moving quickly, trying to ignore the growing dread that clung to me. The further I walked, the more the atmosphere seemed to change. The trees loomed over me, their gnarled branches twisting into grotesque shapes, casting long, distorted shadows across the ground. The very air seemed to thicken, pressing against me with each step. And then I heard it. A low growl vibrating through the ground beneath my feet. I froze. The hairs on my neck stood up. It wasn't just one sound anymore. It was a chorus of them, a symphony of growls, grating noises, like something was moving through the underbrush, something massive, something far more terrifying than I had imagined. The ground trembled beneath me, as though whatever was lurking in the darkness was drawing nearer. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. And then, I saw them. In the distance, through the fog, I saw shapes, large, hulking figures moving through the trees. Their eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the night. Their bodies were massive, distorted, their forms barely visible through the mist. But one thing was clear, they were not human. They were something else. Something ancient. The footsteps I had heard, the shadows, the voice, it was all leading to this moment. Whatever had been awakened on this island was no longer content to hide in the shadows. It was coming for me. I ran, the fog swallowing me whole as I fled deeper into the island. My legs felt like lead, and every breath I took was jagged, burning my lungs. The creatures, those dark, monstrous figures, were closing in. I could feel their presence behind me, the growls reverberating in the air. The sound of their heavy feet slamming against the earth echoed through the jungle, too loud, too close. I stumbled, my foot catching on something in the underbrush, sending me crashing to the ground. Pain shot through my body as I pushed myself up, but there was no time to stop. I had to keep moving. If I didn't, I wouldn't make it. I didn't know how long I ran, it felt like hours. My body was aching, my mind beginning to unravel with exhaustion. I had no plan, no idea where I was going. But the creatures were behind me, and that was enough to keep my legs moving. I came to a clearing, a small patch of land surrounded by twisted trees. It felt like an open wound in the island's thick foliage, an exposed nerve that I couldn't ignore. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. And then I saw it. A stone structure, half buried under the weight of the earth and vines. It looked ancient, much older than anything I had seen before, older than the ruins I had explored earlier. It seemed almost sacred. I didn't know what it was, but something in my gut told me I needed to reach it. Maybe it was the structure's promise of shelter, of safety. Or maybe it was something else, something deeper, something primal. I pushed through the underbrush, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. I reached the stone doorway just as I heard the first of the creatures breaking into the clearing. Their growls were deafening now, a chorus of deep, guttural sounds that vibrated in my chest. I dove into the darkness of the structure, scrambling inside. My flashlight flickered and died, leaving me in complete blackness. I could hear the creatures outside, their growls growing louder, their heavy steps shaking the ground beneath me. I backed into the cold stone wall, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Sweat poured down my face, but I didn't dare move. I had no idea what was waiting for me in the darkness, but it was better than being out there with them. I heard the creatures stop just outside. For a moment, there was only silence, thick and suffocating. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of the noises, but there was nothing, no footsteps, no growls. Just the echo of my own breath. And then I heard it. A voice. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, clearer. The same voice I had heard earlier, calling out from the depths of the fog. The voice was coming from inside the structure. But it wasn't just a voice. It was a whisper, a call, an invitation. I couldn't move. The hairs on my neck stood on end. My entire body tensed as the whispering grew louder, more insistent. The voice wasn't speaking words, not exactly. It was something more. It was a language I didn't understand, but I could feel it deep within my bones. It was the same voice I had heard the night before, and now it was here, calling me into the dark. I closed my eyes and tried to steady myself, but the whispering continued. It was all around me, pressing against my mind, filling my thoughts. It was like the voice was inside me, drowning me in its urgency. I had to get out of here. I had to leave before the creatures found me. But as I turned to run, I heard a sound, not footsteps, not growls, but something far worse. A scraping. A dragging sound. Slow. Methodical. I turned back toward the dark corridor, my heart pounding in my chest. And then, I saw them. The creatures were inside the structure. They weren't just outside anymore. They were in the shadows, moving silently through the darkness, their eyes glowing faintly. Their distorted forms loomed just out of reach, just beyond the edges of the dim light, but I could feel them, their presence was overwhelming. I wasn't sure how many there were. It didn't matter. I had no time. My pulse thudded in my ears as I moved, inch by inch, against the stone wall, trying to make as little noise as possible. But the ground beneath me shifted. The creatures sensed me. I could hear their growls, low and menacing, as they closed in. I reached for the nearest object, a jagged piece of stone that had fallen from the ceiling. My hand shook, but I gripped it tightly, preparing myself for what was to come. I could hear them now, the scraping of claws against stone, the guttural breathing that vibrated through the air. The creatures were close. They were right there, waiting. I closed my eyes, summoning every ounce of courage I had left, and I leapt forward, hurling the stone into the darkness ahead of me. The creatures snarled, but it didn't matter. I was already moving, running for my life. I burst out of the structure, barely avoiding the creatures that were now emerging from the shadows behind me. My breath was ragged, my chest heaving. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stop. But the island had other plans. As I sprinted away, I felt the ground tremble beneath me again. It wasn't just the creatures. It wasn't just the darkness. It was the island itself, the very earth beneath my feet, as if it were alive and angry. The trees around me seemed to shift and warp, their limbs stretching out to grab me, their branches twisting and contorting into shapes that weren't natural. I felt a surge of panic, my mind frantically searching for an escape. But the creatures were everywhere now. They were closing in on me, and there was no way out. And then, in the distance, I saw it. The shadow. It was the same one I had seen earlier, the one that had watched me from the clearing. But now it was larger, darker. Its glowing eyes fixed on me as it stepped forward from the depths of the fog. I stopped. I couldn't run anymore. I was trapped. The shadow before me loomed like a nightmare made flesh, its presence crushing every ounce of hope I had left. Its eyes, glowing with an eerie light, locked onto mine, and I felt every shred of rational thought slip away. The fog swirled around it, thickening, blurring everything else until it was the only thing in focus. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. My body was paralyzed by terror, as if the very air around me had been poisoned by its presence. The creatures were behind me, their growls growing louder as they closed in. The whispering voice, now more like a chant, filled my ears, reverberating in the very depths of my mind. I wanted to scream, to fight, to run, but my limbs refused to obey. The only thing I could do was stand there, frozen, staring into the abyss. The shadow moved closer, its shape becoming clearer, no longer a mere distortion, but something solid, ancient, and terrible. It was tall, towering over me, its form shifting, as though the very essence of the island was woven into its being. Its face was a grotesque mask, one that seemed to flicker and change, never fully taking shape, never staying the same. And then, in a voice that wasn't a voice at all, but a deep, rumbling thought, the shadow spoke. "You trespass on sacred ground," it said. Its voice was like the rumble of thunder, deep and powerful. "The spirits of the land have awoken. The price of your presence is now due." I felt my legs give way beneath me, my knees buckling, but I couldn't look away. The shadow was everywhere now, in the air, in the ground, in the very space around me. The creatures, the ones that had been stalking me, now gathered at its feet, their eyes glowing in unison. There was no escape. No hope. "The land has always been guarded," the shadow continued, its voice echoing in my mind. "The ancient ones never left. They waited. And now they will reclaim what was theirs." A cold wind blew through the clearing, and I shivered. My breath came in ragged gasps as I tried to make sense of what was happening. The island, the creatures, all of it was part of something older, something far beyond my understanding. This wasn't just a haunted place. This was a battleground between the living and the ancient spirits that had once ruled here. I stumbled back, trying to get away, but the ground seemed to shift beneath me, making each step harder. The shadow's presence pressed against me, suffocating, and the creatures began to close in, their glowing eyes now filled with a predatory hunger. I thought about the legends, the stories I had read before coming here, stories of spirits, of guardians who had protected the land for centuries. But I had dismissed them. I had thought they were just myths, just local superstition. Now, I realized how wrong I had been. The shadow raised one massive arm, and the creatures scattered, moving with terrifying speed and precision. They didn't attack me, though. They only watched, waiting. The voice of the shadow grew louder, and its words were more distinct now, as if the island itself was speaking through it. "You will join us, just as all others have. Your soul will feed the land, your essence will be consumed by the ancient spirits. You will never leave this place. You are part of it now. My heart pounded in my chest, the weight of its words crashing over me like a wave. I wanted to fight. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But there was nothing left inside me, just an overwhelming sense of inevitability. The creatures began to advance slowly, their eyes gleaming with that same unholy light. The whispering around me grew to a crescendo, filling the air, pressing in on my mind. But then, something strange happened. The ground beneath me rumbled, and the island seemed to groan in pain. The shadow faltered for just a moment, its form flickering. For a brief instant, it seemed to weaken, as if something inside it was breaking. I didn't know what it was, but it was enough to give me a sliver of hope. Without thinking, I turned and ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I ran as fast as I could, my legs burning, my lungs screaming for air. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The whispering, the growls, the pounding footsteps, they all followed me, echoing in the depths of my mind, but I didn't dare stop. The island was fighting me, shifting, twisting. The trees seemed to reach for me with their gnarled branches, trying to hold me back. But I pushed forward, my hands grasping at whatever I could, my heart thundering in my chest. I didn't know how long I ran. Time seemed to blur together, but eventually I found myself at the edge of the island, staring out at the dark waters. The boat was still there, anchored just offshore, waiting for me. But even as I ran toward it, I could feel the shadow, the creatures, the land itself, pulling me back. I had trespassed, and now the island was claiming its due. I reached the boat, jumping in without a second thought. My hands shook as I untied the ropes, the engine sputtering to life as I pushed away from the shore. But even as I sped out into the open water, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was still there, watching me from the shadows of the island. I looked back once, just once, but the fog had already closed in around the land. It was as if the island had swallowed itself whole. And I knew, deep down, that I would never truly leave. The island had marked me, branded my soul. It had claimed me, and it would never let go. I could still hear the whispering. The island would never forget. He's there, behind the door. I don't know when the noises started. They were subtle at first, a soft rustling, like paper fluttering in the wind. I remember thinking it was just the building settling. An old structure like this always makes some sound. But as the days passed, the sounds didn't stop. They grew. I've been working in the underground tunnels of New York City for nearly 5 years now, and I've never encountered anything like this. The air down here is thick, musty, and heavy with the scent of oil and dust, but the sounds? There's something else. I'm a foreman on a small construction crew tasked with maintaining the tunnels, making sure everything stays in working order. It's the kind of job you don't think much about. You just show up, do your work, and leave. But lately, things have felt different. I started hearing the rustling sounds every night when we'd stay late. At first, it wasn't a big deal. The tunnels echo everything down here. A simple draft can sound like footsteps or like someone shuffling behind you. But that's not what I'm hearing. It's almost like scratching. At first, I thought maybe it was a rat or a raccoon getting into the walls. But the sounds are too deliberate, too rhythmic. And it's not coming from the walls, it's coming from the dark. One night, I finally decided to investigate. I grabbed my flashlight and walked deeper into the tunnel, away from the workers. The others were in the main section, finishing up their tasks for the night, oblivious to the strange noises that had been bothering me for days. I didn't want to alarm them. As I walked, the scratching grew louder. It sounded like claws on metal, scraping slowly. The tunnel grew narrower the further I went, and my breath caught in my throat. My flashlight flickered for a second, just long enough to make my heart race. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light, a reflection, or a rodent. It had to be. But then, I saw it. A door. A door I didn't recognize. It wasn't part of the plans for the tunnel. No doors were supposed to be down here. Just pipes, walls, and the occasional light fixture. This door looked out of place, old, weathered, with rust creeping around its edges. And it was slightly ajar. I froze, my pulse quickening. The scratching stopped. It was as if the tunnel itself was holding its breath. I approached cautiously, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. Maybe it was just a storage room, maybe some old equipment left behind by the previous crew. That was probably it. I could rationalize it. But there was something in the air. A weight. The kind of heaviness that settles deep in your chest when you know something's wrong. I reached for the handle, but my hand trembled. It wasn't just nerves, it felt like something was urging me not to open it. But I had to know. I pushed the door open, and I saw them. There was nothing behind the door, at least not immediately. Just darkness. But as I stepped closer, my flashlight caught something, the shadows in the corners of the room. And I swear, just for a moment, I saw something move. Something large. I quickly stepped back, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The sound returned then, the scratching. But now, it was louder, closer, as if whatever had been waiting in the dark was now right behind the door, waiting for me to make my next move. I slammed the door shut. The noise stopped instantly, and for a long, eerie moment, everything was still. I stood there, heart pounding in my chest, trying to calm myself. It was just a trick of the light, I thought. There was nothing there. No monsters, no creatures. Just the tunnel, and the sounds, and my imagination. But when I turned to leave, I noticed something. Footprints. Not mine. The dirt and dust had been disturbed, as if something or someone had been walking around in here. And they were fresh. That's when the real fear set in. Something was in the tunnels. Something I wasn't supposed to find. The scratching began again, louder this time. It was no longer just behind the door. It was everywhere. And I knew, deep down, that whatever it was not just lurking in the dark. It was hunting. I ran back to the main section of the tunnel, my mind racing. What had I seen? What had I felt? It didn't make sense. But there was no denying what I had just experienced. I had to get out of there. But I knew that no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't escape the fear that had taken root in my heart. The scratching would follow. It always did. And the door? It was still waiting for someone else to open it. It's been days since that night, but I can't shake the feeling of dread. Every time I close my eyes, I see that door. I hear the scratching. The sound is haunting me, following me everywhere I go. At work, I can barely concentrate. I can't explain what I saw or what I felt, but I know one thing for sure. I'm not the only one who's heard those noises. I tried to talk to the guys about it, but they just laughed. They don't understand. How could they? They haven't seen what I've seen. To them, it's all just a joke. You're just hearing rats, man. It's the tunnels. You're overthinking it. But I know it's not just rats. The scratching continues. It's become more frequent, more erratic. I catch myself listening for it, even when I'm not working. The sound is always there, lurking in the background. It's in the walls, the floors, the ceiling, it's everywhere. Every creak of the building, every shift of the pipes, every drop of water that falls from the ceiling feels like the sound of something moving just out of sight. But what? I've tried to explain it to myself. I've told myself over and over that it's nothing. That it's just the tunnels, the city's infrastructure breaking down. Maybe there's a colony of rats in the walls, or maybe some animal has made a nest down here. But when I try to convince myself, the fear only grows stronger. Something deep inside me knows that it's not just animals. Something bigger is down here with us. And every time I hear that scratching, I know that it's getting closer. It's been a week now since I first found the door, and I can't stop thinking about it. I can't stop thinking about what's behind it. I went back to that spot the very next night, when the others had left for the day. I had to see it again, had to know if I had imagined it all. The door was still there, waiting. The air around it felt heavier now, as if it had been holding its breath, just like me. I approached cautiously, my flashlight trembling in my hand. I had to open it again. I had to. But when I reached for the handle, I stopped. The scratching had begun again. This time, it wasn't just the sound of claws on metal. It was louder, deeper, like something was scraping against the very walls of the tunnel. My heart skipped a beat. My breathing became shallow, panicked. What was happening? What was down there? I pressed my ear to the door, trying to listen. My body tensed as I heard something that made my blood run cold. It wasn't just the sound of scratching. It was something else, something worse. A voice. A low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from the darkness itself. It wasn't a human voice, it was animalistic. It was desperate, angry, and it was getting closer. I could feel the heat radiating from the door, as if something was pressing against it from the other side, something that wanted to get out. I pulled my ear away and stepped back, my chest tight with fear. My thoughts were a blur. The whispers were growing louder, almost deafening, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead, my mind was paralyzed. I couldn't understand what was happening, but I knew one thing, I couldn't open that door again. But then, something changed. The door. It was moving. I stared in horror as the edges of the door began to shift, like something was pushing against it from the inside. The rusted hinges creaked as they were forced to their limits. And then, with a terrible screech, the door began to open, slowly, agonizingly slow, as if whatever was behind it didn't want to be seen, but had no choice but to reveal itself. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, watching as the door opened just a crack. And there, in the darkness, I saw them. A pair of glowing eyes. They gleamed with an unnatural light, like nothing I'd ever seen before. Then I heard it again. The scratching. But now it was mixed with something else, a wet, slithering sound, like something crawling on the floor, dragging itself toward me. I knew, in that moment, that whatever was behind that door wasn't just some animal. It was something far worse. Something old, something ancient, something that had been waiting for a very long time. The door was still opening, inch by inch, and I knew I had moments, maybe seconds, before whatever was on the other side fully emerged. My heart pounded in my chest. My breath was ragged. I had to run. I had to get out of there. But the door kept opening. I turned and sprinted down the tunnel, my legs burning, my mind screaming at me to keep going. The scratching followed me, getting louder, closer, until it was right behind me. I didn't dare look back. I didn't dare stop. I could feel it. Whatever it was close. Too close. And then, just as I thought I couldn't run anymore, I heard something that froze me in my tracks. A scream. It wasn't human. It was guttural, raw, full of terror. And it came from behind me. I dared not look. But in my heart, I knew. It was one of the guys. It was too late for them. Too late for all of us. I ran faster. I don't know how long I ran. My legs felt like they were made of lead, and my heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. Every breath I took felt shallow and sharp, like I was inhaling glass. But I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving. I could hear the sound of claws scraping against the ground, the wet, slithering noises growing louder with every step. It was following me. I forced myself to focus. I couldn't let panic take over. I had to think clearly, had to find a way out. The tunnel stretched for miles, twisting and turning, but I had to know the way back. The others, were they alive? Were they still down here? No. I couldn't worry about them. I had to survive. The darkness closed in on me from all sides. The lights flickered overhead, casting long, trembling shadows that seemed to reach for me like fingers. The air was thick with the smell of rot and dampness, mixing with something else, something foul, metallic. I couldn't stop thinking about those eyes. Those glowing eyes. How they gleamed in the darkness, staring at me like they knew exactly what I was feeling. I could almost still see them behind my eyelids, could still hear that scraping sound. Now, in my mind, it was like it was all around me. No matter how fast I ran, I couldn't escape it. Then came the footsteps. Heavy, thumping, like something huge, something far too large to be a normal rat or even a pack of them. It was close. So close. I could feel the vibrations in the floor beneath my feet, like the ground itself was shaking with every step it took. I turned a corner, hoping for a moment of relief, but there was none. The tunnel stretched before me like an endless maw, dark and suffocating. I had no idea where I was anymore. I had lost all sense of direction. Then, I heard it. A low growl. A low, guttural sound that made my stomach twist with terror. It was too close. I dared not look back, but I could feel it, whatever it was, closing in on me, its presence like a suffocating weight on my chest. And then, just as suddenly, everything went silent. The scraping, the growling, the sound of footsteps, they all stopped, leaving only the pounding of my own heart in my ears. I froze. The silence was worse than the sound. The complete absence of noise sent a chill down my spine, and I knew that it was waiting for me. But I didn't know where it was. I couldn't hear it anymore. It was as though it had vanished, like it had dissolved into the darkness itself. I took a step forward, but I didn't feel any safer. Every inch of the tunnel felt like it was closing in on me. My breath came out in shallow bursts, and I realized I was shaking. Keep moving, I told myself, my voice barely a whisper, as though speaking too loudly would make whatever was hunting me take notice. I walked faster, my mind racing for some kind of solution, some kind of escape. I had to find a way out, but I didn't know which direction I was headed in. The tunnels all looked the same, and I could feel myself getting more and more lost with every turn. That's when I saw it. A faint light, flickering in the distance. It wasn't much, just a weak, wavering glow, but it was enough. It was a sign that there was a way out, a way back to the surface. It was the only hope I had. I pushed myself harder, my legs burning, but I couldn't stop. The light grew closer, but so did the silence. The oppressive, all-consuming silence that made it feel like I wasn't alone anymore. I wasn't sure which was worse, the sounds or the absence of them. The light came into focus as I rounded another corner, and for a moment I thought I was safe. But I wasn't. From the shadows, it emerged. The creature. It was more monstrous than I could have ever imagined. Bigger than any rat, bigger than anything I had ever seen. Its body was long, slick with something that glistened in the dim light. Its legs were too many, crawling in all directions, and its mouth was a gaping maw filled with sharp, gleaming teeth. Its eyes. The same glowing eyes. It was only a few feet away now, and I could see every horrifying detail. The skin was mottled with patches of rot, and its breath came in ragged, wet gasps that smelled like death. It didn't move right away. It just stared at me, as if deciding what to do next. I had no time to think. No time to plan. I ran. I ran faster than I had ever run in my life, my body screaming with exhaustion, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't look back. I didn't dare. Behind me, I could hear it now, the slithering, the growling, the thumping of its massive feet hitting the ground. It was getting closer. It was faster than I was. Then, the ground beneath me shook again. The tunnel seemed to tremble as if it was collapsing on itself. I didn't stop to look. I didn't stop to wonder why. I just ran. But as I reached the end of the tunnel, where I had seen the light, it disappeared. The exit, the door, the way out, all of it was gone. I was trapped. And then I heard the whisper again. It wasn't from behind me this time. It was all around me, 1,000 voices, all whispering the same thing. It's too late. I turned around, my breath caught in my throat. And there it was. The door. The one I had first seen days ago. The one I thought was just a figment of my imagination. But it wasn't. It was real. The door creaked open slowly, and the darkness on the other side began to move. I couldn't move. The door creaked louder, its rusted hinges protesting against the pressure from the other side. Every inch of it that opened felt like a nail being driven into my skull. The darkness behind it pressed forward, as though it were alive, and I felt myself being pulled toward it, helplessly. There was something on the other side. Something that wanted out. It was impossible to ignore the pull, the overwhelming force of its presence. The air grew colder, the silence suffocating. I could hear my heart thumping in my chest, louder now, as though it, too, was afraid. The whispers grew again. They were louder now, almost clear. A dozen voices, overlapping, each one a thread of terror pulling at my sanity. It's too late, they said. It's always been too late. My eyes darted around the tunnel, but there was no escape. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, they all seemed to close in around me. The darkness from the door spread out like a flood, pouring into the tunnel, swallowing up the light. I had to move. I had to run. But my feet wouldn't move. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. What is this? What's happening? I tried to tell myself it was just my mind, that I was losing it from fear, but I knew deep down it wasn't. The creatures, the eyes, the whispers, the door, it was all real. And it was too late to escape. The darkness beyond the door seemed to deepen, and I saw something shifting within it. A shadow. No, more than just a shadow. It was a figure, something enormous, something that had been waiting in the dark for so long. The figure stepped into the light, and I saw it fully for the first time. It was like nothing I could have imagined. It was towering, far too large to be human, with long, spindly limbs that stretched unnaturally. Its skin was a slick, glossy black, mottled with patches of what looked like rotting flesh. Its eyes, those gleaming, unnatural eyes, were the same ones I had seen behind the door, but now they were all I could focus on. They were endless pits of darkness, gleaming with that same horrifying light. It was as if they were staring into me, through me, seeing every fear, every weakness, every secret. I stumbled backward, my legs giving out beneath me, and I fell to the ground with a sickening thud. The figure didn't move at first, just stood there, looming over me, its presence suffocating. The whispers grew louder, the words clearer now. It's waiting. It's always been waiting. I tried to crawl away, but it was no use. The darkness had swallowed the light completely. The tunnel was now a prison, and the door, the one I had thought would be my salvation, had become the thing that would seal my fate. The creature stepped forward, its eyes never leaving mine. Each step it took seemed to make the ground tremble. I could feel the weight of its presence pressing against me, pulling at my very soul. I knew I couldn't outrun it, couldn't fight it. It was beyond anything I could comprehend. And then, in the blink of an eye, it was standing right in front of me. I could see its sharp, twisted mouth, its teeth gleaming in the darkness like jagged knives. But what terrified me more than anything was the smell, the rot, the decay, the stench of death. It was overwhelming. For a moment, everything went still. I could hear nothing but the sound of my own ragged breathing. The creature's eyes never wavered from mine. Then it spoke. The voice was low, rasping, a mix of something human and something otherworldly, like the earth itself was speaking through it. You shouldn't have opened the door. The words were like a curse, seeping into my skin, freezing me in place. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. I was paralyzed, trapped by the very thing I had tried to escape. It tilted its head, studying me, and I could feel its hunger. Not for food, but for something deeper. It wanted more than my flesh, it wanted my fear, my soul. It was feeding on it. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was dry, tight, as though the air itself had been stolen from my lungs. The whispers returned, this time so loud they were deafening, the words repeating in a sickening chorus. It's waiting. It's always been waiting. The creature's mouth stretched into a grin, impossibly wide. Its teeth were like shards of glass, sharp and glistening. I could feel it leaning closer, its breath hot against my face. You can't escape it. No one can. And then it struck. I don't remember much after that. The world blurred, spinning. The darkness closed in around me, swallowing everything. The last thing I felt was its grip on my arm, cold and relentless, dragging me toward the door. And then, nothing. I woke to a suffocating silence. For a long moment, I lay there in the dark, unsure of where I was. My head throbbed, and my body ached as though it had been stretched to its limits. But the feeling of weightlessness, of not truly being grounded, was the most unsettling part. It was as if I had fallen into another world entirely. I tried to move, but my limbs wouldn't obey. My fingers twitched, but I couldn't bring myself to sit up. The weight of what had happened, the creature, the whispers, the door, it all flooded back in fragments. I couldn't focus. My mind was shattered, pieces of terror scattered like shards of glass. But there was one thing I knew, the door was still there. I could sense it. The oppressive weight of its presence lingered, even in this new place, this new reality. I wasn't sure if I was awake or trapped in some nightmare, but I knew that the door wasn't just a doorway. It was a part of something much worse, something I couldn't escape. Not even in death. The silence was broken by a low, rumbling sound, like the earth itself was groaning. My eyes snapped open, and I found myself lying in a dimly lit room. It was unfamiliar, but the shadows that clung to the walls were somehow comforting. They felt like home. They felt like the darkness beyond the door. I pushed myself up slowly, the room spinning as I tried to stand. My legs wobbled beneath me, and I caught myself on a nearby table, the wood cold and rough against my palms. My breath was shallow, ragged. Something was wrong. The air felt thick, as if I were breathing through water. And then I saw it. The door. It stood at the far end of the room, its frame dark against the dim light, its surface old and scarred. The same door. The one I had opened. The one that had let the creature out. I could feel my pulse quicken. The whispers returned, just faint murmurs at first, but they grew louder with each passing second. You shouldn't have opened the door. I wanted to scream, to run, but the terror that gripped me was paralyzing. I knew I couldn't escape. I knew there was no way out. The door had followed me, carried me into this nightmare. I backed away, my heart pounding, my breath coming in short gasps. The room seemed to stretch before me, the walls closing in, the shadows thickening like tendrils, pulling me closer to that inevitable fate. I turned away from the door, but the whispers filled the room now, swirling around me, growing louder, clearer. It's always been waiting. It's never going to let you go. I clutched my head, trying to block out the voices, but they drowned everything out. The sound of my own breath, the frantic thumping of my heart, it all faded beneath the relentless tide of those words. I looked back toward the door. It was open. A crack at first. Then wider. Wider still. The darkness beyond it seemed to pulse, to breathe, to beckon. The figure I had seen before was there, its shape a mass of shifting shadows and glowing eyes. Its gaze locked onto mine, and I felt its coldness seep into my bones. And then, I understood. It wasn't just waiting for me. It was waiting for all of us. The door wasn't a portal, it was a trap. A doorway into something far older, far darker. Something that fed on fear, on desperation. It had been there before I opened it. It had always been there, behind the door. And now that I had unlocked it, it was never going away. The creature stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. Each step was a weight on my chest, a promise of what was to come. The walls seemed to close in, but there was nowhere to go. I turned to run. I tried to escape, but my legs were leaden, my body too weak. I stumbled, falling to the floor. The creature was closer now, its mouth stretching impossibly wide, its teeth glistening in the dim light. It was smiling. No, not smiling. It was hungry. The whispers grew louder, deafening, until it felt like my head was going to explode. The last thing I saw was its eyes, endless, black pits, filled with all the horrors that had ever existed. And then, nothing. I don't know how long I've been here. How long it's been since that moment, since the creature found me, since the door opened. The whispers never stop. They follow me wherever I go, in the silence, in the shadows, in the darkest corners of my mind. I can hear them now. It's always been too late. And I know, with a cold certainty, that it will never stop. The door is always there, waiting. And I am too. The ghosts of the old farm. When we first arrived at the old farm in Virginia, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but every time I looked out over the sprawling fields, a strange unease washed over me. The house, though beautiful in its own way, had an unsettling charm. The kind of charm that belonged to places that had seen years of forgotten lives. My wife, Julia, was eager to start this new chapter of our lives. She saw the farm as a perfect place to escape the city, to start fresh and rebuild. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into a history that didn't want to be disturbed. The first few days went by with the typical flurry of unpacking boxes and setting up the place. The sun shone, the air was crisp, and everything seemed quiet, too quiet. I told myself it was just the isolation of country life, but there were moments, fleeting but sharp, when the quiet would be interrupted by a creaking floorboard or the sound of something moving in the attic. The house was old. It could have been just the house settling, I thought. But then, on the first night after we finished settling in, I heard it. It started off as a faint sound, like a soft scrape, almost imperceptible. I dismissed it, attributing it to the house's age. But then it came again, louder this time. A dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. I lay in bed, staring into the darkness, my heart beginning to beat a little faster. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a mouse or some loose floorboards. But then came a sound that stopped my thoughts cold, a door creaking open, followed by the faintest whisper, as if someone were breathing right next to me. I didn't move. I didn't want to wake Julia. She was sound asleep beside me, unaware of the growing tension in the room. But I could feel it. Something was here, something that shouldn't be. The whisper came again, this time clearer. It wasn't in my head. I wasn't imagining it. It was a voice, low and unintelligible, coming from the hallway outside our bedroom. I wanted to get up, to check it out, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I was frozen, my mind racing with every possible explanation, none of which made any sense. After what felt like an eternity, the sound stopped, and the house returned to its eerie stillness. The silence hung in the air like a thick fog. But the peace didn't last. I kept telling myself it was just my nerves, the unfamiliar surroundings playing tricks on me. It had to be. Yet, the feeling of something being wrong never quite left me. As the days passed, I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched. It wasn't just the occasional creak of the floor or the strange sounds in the night. It was more than that. There was a presence. I felt it when I worked in the garden, when I walked through the woods behind the house. And when I sat alone in the kitchen, I could hear the faintest shuffling, like someone was just out of sight, watching me. I tried to tell Julia, but she laughed it off. "It's just an old house," she said. "You're overthinking things." But I wasn't so sure. That night, after Julia had gone to bed, I decided to stay up. I wasn't going to let my imagination get the better of me. The house was just settling, just shifting as old houses do. I'd stay up, listen closely, and prove to myself that there was nothing here. I sat in the living room, the dim light from a single lamp casting long shadows on the walls. Every creak, every shift of the floorboards made me jump. But I told myself it was normal. I tried to focus on something else, anything to distract myself. But then, out of nowhere, a cold draft swept through the room. The temperature dropped, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I stood up, heart racing. The draft wasn't coming from anywhere near the windows or doors. It was as if the air itself had shifted, as though something unseen was moving through the house. And then, in the dark hallway, I saw it. A shadow. Not just a shadow from the lamp. It was a figure, tall and thin, standing at the end of the hallway, just beyond the reach of the light. My heart stopped. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The figure didn't move either, standing perfectly still. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes, it was gone. I ran to the hallway, my pulse hammering in my chest. But there was nothing there. Just the long, empty hallway leading to the back door. I walked slowly, checking every room, but the house was empty, as it always was. I went back to the living room, feeling both foolish and terrified. The silence in the house seemed louder now, oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I had seen wasn't just in my mind. It was real. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound, every shift of the house seemed magnified. I listened to the wind outside, the creaking of the old wood, but nothing could calm the racing thoughts in my head. And then, as I lay there in the dark, I heard it again. The whisper. It was closer this time. I could hear it, soft and deliberate, coming from right outside our bedroom door. "Leave." I froze. I don't know how long I lay there, too scared to move, my breath shallow, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or my imagination. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. The farm had been here long before us. And someone, was still here. The days that followed were a blur of tension. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, following my every move. Every sound, every crack of the house seemed to grow louder in my ears. I couldn't tell if it was my mind playing tricks on me or if something truly sinister was lurking just beyond the walls. Julia noticed the change in me, of course. She asked if I was okay, but I didn't want to admit the truth, not yet. How could I explain it to her? That I was hearing voices, seeing shadows where there shouldn't be any? That the house seemed to be alive, pulsing with something dark and ancient? No, I couldn't. So, I kept quiet, and with each passing day, my anxiety grew. One morning, as I was working in the garden, I saw something strange. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of movement by the old barn. A flash of light, something white, flickering in the sun. I turned to look, but when I focused on it, nothing was there. I brushed it off as just my imagination, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. What was that? Was it just a reflection, or had I really seen something? I knew there was something wrong with this place, but I wasn't sure how to confront it. That night, Julia and I sat at the kitchen table, having dinner. The tension in the air was palpable. I could see the concern in her eyes, the way she kept glancing at me as if waiting for me to say something. But I couldn't. It was then that we heard it, a loud bang from upstairs, like something heavy had fallen to the floor. Julia jumped up from her seat. "What was that?" she asked, her voice shaky. I don't know," I muttered, my stomach tightening. I stood up, my legs heavy, and started toward the stairs. But before I could take another step, I heard it again, this time from behind me. A soft, low moan. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. The kitchen was as still as it had been before, and yet the air felt thicker, colder, as if the house itself were holding its breath. "Did you hear that?" Julia asked, her voice trembling. I nodded, though I had no explanation. "It's nothing, probably just the house settling." I didn't believe it. I couldn't. The moan had sounded too real, too human. That night, as we lay in bed, Julia turned to me. "Are you sure you're okay?" she asked softly, her hand resting on my chest. "I'm fine," I replied, though I didn't feel fine. The silence of the house pressed down on me, suffocating. I could hear the whispering again, low and faint, like the wind, but this time it wasn't just one voice. It was many, overlapping, murmuring indistinct words. I sat up quickly, my heart pounding. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice shaky. Julia turned toward me, her eyes wide with concern. "Hear what?" "The voices," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "The whispering." She looked at me, confused, then slowly shook her head. "You're just imagining things. It's the house, it makes weird noises." I wanted to argue, to tell her that this wasn't just the house, but I couldn't. How could I explain what I had heard? How could I make her understand that something was wrong with this place? The next morning, I decided to take a walk around the property, hoping to clear my head. The field stretched out before me, empty and silent. The barn loomed in the distance, its weathered wood standing like a silent sentinel. I felt drawn to it, like something was pulling me toward it. As I approached the barn, I noticed something strange. The door, which had always been locked when we first arrived, was now slightly ajar. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't unlocked it. I hadn't even touched it. Tentatively, I stepped forward, my hand reaching for the door. The wood creaked as I pushed it open, revealing the dark interior of the barn. The smell of old hay and earth filled the air, thick and musty. But it wasn't the smell that made my stomach churn. It was the sight of the floor. Something had been dragged through the dirt, large, deep gouges, like something with enormous claws had scraped across the floor. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a step inside. The shadows in the barn seemed to move, shifting in the corners of my vision. And then I saw it. A pair of glowing eyes. They were at the far end of the barn, hidden in the darkness. At first, I thought they were reflections from a piece of broken glass, but as I stepped closer, I saw that they were unmistakably eyes, large, beady, and filled with an unnatural light. Before I could react, the eyes disappeared into the darkness, leaving only the echo of their presence behind. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in short gasps. My mind raced with terror. What had I just seen? It couldn't have been real. It was too unbelievable, too horrifying. But deep down, I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. Whatever was haunting this place was no figment of my imagination. I ran back to the house, locking the door behind me. I didn't tell Julia about what I'd seen. Not yet. But I knew one thing for sure: the house wasn't the only thing we needed to fear. There was something in the barn. Something that had been waiting for us. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the scratching sound again, now louder, as if it were right outside our window. I lay there, wide awake, eyes fixed on the dark ceiling, my heart hammering in my chest. And then, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow and deliberate. They were coming from upstairs. "Get out." It was a whisper, cold and distant, yet somehow closer than before. I didn't wait any longer. I grabbed Julia by the arm and pulled her out of bed. She looked at me, terrified. "What's happening? What's going on?" "We have to leave," I said, my voice breaking. "Now." But it was too late. We turned toward the door. And that was when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of something heavy moving across the floor, getting closer. I looked back at Julia, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. But she didn't need to ask. We both knew. We were no longer alone. Panic set in as the footsteps grew louder, closer, more insistent. My heart was pounding in my chest as I gripped Julia's hand tightly, pulling her toward the door. But before we could take another step, the air seemed to change, thickened, suffocating. A coldness crept into the room, crawling up our spines, freezing the blood in our veins. We reached the door, but it wouldn't open. I twisted the handle desperately, but it refused to budge. My breath came in short, frantic gasps as I yanked harder, my mind racing. Why wasn't it opening? It had never stuck before. I turned to Julia, panic in her eyes, and whispered, "We're trapped. We're not getting out." The footsteps stopped suddenly. Silence felt like a heavy curtain, and I realized then that I could no longer hear anything, no breathing, no heartbeats, just a deep, oppressive silence that felt as though the house itself had stopped breathing. And then, the whisper came again, this time louder, more distinct. "Leave now." It was a voice, but not one that could be placed. It wasn't human. It was ancient and hollow, filled with a depth of malice that made the air tremble. My blood ran cold, and I took a step back, my eyes scanning the room for some sign of what was happening. Then I saw it. In the corner of the room, near the shadows where the light couldn't reach, I noticed movement. A faint shape, just a flicker at first, like a shadow trying to take form. But as I watched, it grew. It stretched, twisted, and then became something unmistakably human. But not quite. It was a figure draped in tattered, weathered clothing, its face hidden in the darkness. Yet, somehow, I could feel its eyes on us, burning through the veil of darkness. And its eyes, they were glowing, just like the ones I had seen in the barn. "Leave now." The voice echoed again, this time more insistent, more commanding. I turned to Julia, her face white as a sheet. "Do you see that? Please, tell me you see that." I was practically shouting now, my mind unraveling at the sight of the ghostly figure that stood silently, watching us. Julia's voice trembled as she whispered, I don't see anything." Her words made my stomach churn. How could she not see it? The figure was standing there, as clear as day, yet she couldn't see it. That thought twisted inside my mind, gnawing at me. Was I losing my sanity? Or was the figure truly invisible to her? Was I the only one it was haunting? I didn't have time to think any longer. The figure stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. The air grew colder still, and I could feel an overwhelming pressure in my chest, as if the very atmosphere was pressing in on us. I grabbed Julia's arm and pulled her away from the door, dragging her back into the center of the room. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice shaking, though I knew deep down that we had no place to go. The house was closing in around us, trapping us. No matter where we went, the thing, whatever it was, would follow. I had no choice but to face it. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, and turned toward the darkened corner of the room where the figure had appeared. The glowing eyes were now locked on me, burning with intensity. And then, to my horror, I saw the outline of its mouth slowly twist into a grin, an eerie, twisted grin that sent a chill straight through my bones. The figure stepped into the dim light, its movements slow and deliberate. And I realized then what it was, no longer just a shadow, but a full, horrifying form. It was a man, or at least it had once been. His face was a grotesque mask of decay, skin stretched tight over bones that seemed to move independently, as if the flesh was too thin to contain them. His eyes burned with an unnatural, sickly glow, and his mouth opened wider, the grin growing even more disturbing. His teeth were yellowed and sharp, like the fangs of some predatory creature. "Leave or die." The voice wasn't the same as before. It was rasping, guttural, full of malice and venom. I stumbled back, trying to put distance between us, but the figure followed, its movements impossibly fast. I couldn't think. My mind screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The house was like a maze, and the barn, with its dark secrets, felt miles away. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and panicked, as I desperately searched for an escape, but the walls closed in on me. "Leave, before you become one of us." The whisper came again, and this time it wasn't just from one direction. It surrounded us, a chorus of voices, all the same, dead, hollow, and desperate. They echoed through the walls, through the floorboards, and I could feel them pressing against me, choking the air from my lungs. I turned to Julia, her face pale and frozen in fear. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She was trapped, frozen in place by the same invisible force that had a hold of me. "Julia!" I shouted, but my voice seemed to be swallowed by the oppressive silence. It wasn't just the figure anymore. It was everything around us, the house, the land, the air, closing in, trying to swallow us whole. The more I struggled, the more I realized that the house was part of the nightmare. It was alive, and it wanted us. In one final, desperate act, I pulled Julia toward the front door. But as we reached it, something slammed into my chest. A force, cold and unyielding, pushing me back. The door wouldn't open. I pounded on it, yelling for help, but there was no one to hear us. It was too late. A cold hand gripped my shoulder from behind, and I turned to see the figure standing right there, its glowing eyes inches from my face. Its mouth opened wide, and I felt a cold breath wash over me, the stench of decay overwhelming. "You're already here. You're already part of us." The figure reached for me. Its hands, skeletal, long, and twisted, clawed at my skin, tearing into it. I screamed in agony, but there was no escape. And then, everything went black. I don't know how long I was unconscious. Time had become a blur, a tangled mess of fear and confusion. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing in my chest, my mind screaming at me to get up, to run. But when I opened my eyes, I found myself in an unfamiliar place, lying on a hard, uneven surface. The scent of damp earth and decaying wood filled the air, and a cold breeze blew through the cracks in the walls. I sat up quickly, my vision blurred and disoriented. Where was I? My head throbbed as I looked around, taking in the darkness. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust, but when they did, the horrifying truth hit me. I was in the basement, or what seemed to be the remains of it. The walls were crumbling, covered in patches of moss, and the wooden beams overhead seemed to groan under the weight of time. I tried to stand, but my legs were weak, unsteady. I stumbled to my feet, the cold floor beneath me slick with moisture. The house felt different now. The air had a weight to it, heavy with something I couldn't quite place. Something wrong. Julia? I whispered, my voice hoarse. There was no answer. Panic surged in my chest again, but I swallowed it down. I couldn't fall apart, not yet. I needed to find her. She had to be here somewhere. I made my way across the room, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. As I moved, the shadows in the corners seemed to shift, watching me, waiting. The floor creaked beneath me with every step, the sound reverberating through the silence like a warning. I could feel eyes on me, though I could see no one. The house was alive with whispers, low and insistent, like 1,000 voices speaking in unison. Leave, leave now. I shook my head, trying to clear it. The voices were all around me now, each one sounding more desperate, more pleading. I pressed my hands to my ears, but it didn't help. The sound was coming from inside me, from deep in my mind. I couldn't escape it. I found the staircase leading up from the basement, its wooden steps old and worn, creaking with every step I took. The air grew colder as I climbed, the temperature dropping by the second, until I was shivering uncontrollably. Something about the house, something in its very foundation, seemed to be dragging me down. It didn't want me to leave. It wanted me to stay. Julia! I shouted again, my voice breaking. There was no response. I reached the top of the stairs and found myself standing in the hallway, but it felt different, twisted. The familiar house was gone, replaced by something darker, more sinister. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, and the shadows grew thicker, stretching out toward me like fingers of some unseen monster. The very air tasted foul, thick with decay, and the floorboards beneath my feet creaked as though they were alive. I took a tentative step forward, but then I froze. From somewhere deep within the house, I heard it, the sound of scraping, of claws dragging against the floor. It wasn't just one sound. It was many, all coming from different directions, surrounding me. The rats. My stomach turned as the realization hit. The giant, nightmarish creatures that had haunted the tunnels beneath New York. The ones I thought were just a story, a figment of my imagination. But now, the sound was unmistakable. The rats were here. I spun around, searching for a way out, but the house seemed to stretch endlessly, its dark corners hiding things that shouldn't be there. The walls were closing in on me, the space shrinking with every breath I took. I turned to the left and saw it. A shadow moving quickly across the floor, far too fast for anything human. The shape was large, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. And then there were more, hundreds of them, all skittering across the floor, their eyes glinting with an unnatural hunger. They were huge, monstrous, their bodies glistening with a sickly sheen. I couldn't breathe. The room spun around me, and I felt my legs give out. I fell to the floor, scrambling to get away, but the rats were already closing in. They were everywhere, their tiny claws tapping against the floor, their mouths gaping open, revealing rows of sharp teeth. The scraping sound grew louder, more insistent. It was no longer just the rats. The floor beneath me was shifting, moving, as if something was trying to push its way up from beneath the earth itself. I looked up just in time to see a figure step out from the shadows. It was Julia. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror, but there was something wrong with her, something off. Her skin was stretched too tight, her body stiff, as if she were no longer in control. She moved toward me, but her steps were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet whose strings had been pulled too tightly. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible, a hollow rasp. But there was no humanity in her eyes, only a cold emptiness. "Julia, no!" I screamed, reaching out to her, but my hand passed through her as though she were nothing more than mist. She was gone. The figure that had once been my wife was nothing but an echo, a shadow that faded before my eyes. "You're too late," a voice whispered in my ear, chilling my very bones. It was the same voice from before, the one that had told us to leave, to run. It was the voice of the house itself, of the ghosts that roamed here, that had never left. Suddenly, the rats surged forward, their massive bodies colliding with me. Their teeth sank into my flesh, and I screamed in agony. But the pain was nothing compared to the terror that seized my heart as I felt the floor beneath me break away, plunging me into the darkness below. I was falling, and as I fell, I realized with terrifying clarity that I would never escape this place. The house had claimed me. I was now part of its history, part of its curse. And I would never be alone. The darkness swallowed me whole, an abyss that had no end. For a moment, everything was a blur, a black void where my body seemed to float, weightless, disconnected from reality. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The rats, the house, Julia. None of it made sense. It couldn't be real. It couldn't be. But then, the weight returned. My feet slammed into something solid, the impact sending a shockwave through my body. My legs buckled beneath me, and I hit the floor hard, gasping for breath, my chest heaving. I was no longer falling, but I was somewhere else, somewhere I had never been. I pushed myself up, trembling, my hands scraping against the cold, rough surface beneath me. I was in a cavernous space now, more like a crypt than a basement. The air was thick with the stench of mildew, rot, and decay. The walls were lined with stone, ancient and covered in grime. The dim light that filtered through the cracks in the ceiling cast eerie shadows across the room, making the space seem alive in a way that was unnatural, malevolent. I could hear them again, scratching, moving. It was coming from every direction, from the cracks in the walls, from the floor beneath me. The rats were still here, their tiny claws clicking against the stone, their breathing harsh and labored. But it wasn't just the rats. I stood, my heart pounding, my legs weak beneath me, as I looked around. There were shapes in the shadows, figures standing just out of my line of sight. I could feel their eyes on me, staring, judging. I couldn't see them clearly, but I could sense them, their presence. They were watching me, waiting for something. I heard the voice again. This time, it was a whisper, so faint I could barely make it out, but it still chilled me to the bone. "You are part of us now." I turned, but there was no one behind me. The space was empty. Just the rats, crawling through the darkness, their glowing eyes the only thing I could focus on. My thoughts were a jumbled mess. I tried to tell myself it wasn't real, that I had to wake up, but there was no escape. I had seen it too clearly, the house, the spirits, the rats, and they were all connected, tied together by something ancient and horrible. I took a step forward, my body trembling, my mind screaming at me to turn back. But I couldn't. Something was drawing me deeper into the house, into its bowels, where the rats had come from. It was as if the house had a pull on me, an irresistible force that I couldn't break free from. Every step I took, the darkness closed in around me, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. You cannot leave. I tried to run, to escape the grip of the house, but my legs betrayed me. I stumbled, falling to my knees, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I looked around, desperate, but there was nowhere to go. No way out. The rats were everywhere now, scurrying across the floor, moving closer, their eyes gleaming in the dark. And then, I saw them. Figures in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the dim light. They were tall, their bodies skeletal and thin, dressed in tattered clothes that clung to their bones. Their faces were twisted, their eyes hollow, like ghosts of a long-forgotten past. They moved toward me slowly, silently, their hands outstretched. I tried to speak, to scream, but no sound came from my throat. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving me gasping, suffocating. The figures loomed over me now, their presence suffocating. I could feel their cold breath on my skin, hear the faintest whisper of their voices. You're one of us now. The words were chilling, hollow, and they filled my mind, drowning out everything else. The rats circled around me, their bodies pressing against mine, biting at my clothes, tearing at my flesh. And still, the figures drew closer, their skeletal hands reaching for me. And then, I felt it. A sharp, searing pain as one of the figures reached out, its cold fingers brushing against my neck. It was as if its touch drained the life from me, sucking the warmth from my body, replacing it with an icy coldness. I gasped, struggling to pull away, but it was useless. The cold spread, wrapping itself around my chest, tightening my throat. I looked up at the figures, their faces twisted in smiles that were anything but human. The last thing I saw before the darkness claimed me was Julia's face, her pale eyes staring back at me, hollow and empty. The house had claimed us both. Whispers among the sand dunes. The desert of Nevada is vast, a never-ending stretch of sand and heat. I'd heard the stories before, the ones about the emptiness that eats away at your sanity. But I never believed them, not until I had to experience it myself. I had come here to escape, to find peace after years of fighting battles that no one would understand. I thought the solitude of the desert would give me that. A fresh start. Somewhere I could find my thoughts again, clear the noise from my mind. But instead, it felt like I was being swallowed whole, bit by bit, with each passing day. At first, I thought I was hearing things. A whisper in the wind, a sound carried by the breeze, fleeting, impossible to catch. But the longer I stayed in the desert, the more frequent the whispers became. Soft, indistinct murmurs that sounded like voices, but no one was around. I had set up camp in a small, barely noticeable hollow between two sand dunes. It was a peaceful spot, far from the nearest road, where I could be alone with the desert. But there was something about it that unsettled me. Something about the way the wind moved, the way the sand seemed to shift as if it had a mind of its own. I'd wake in the middle of the night to the sound of scratching, faint, almost imperceptible. the kind of sound that could easily be written off as the wind scraping against the sand. But no matter how hard I tried to dismiss it, the sound felt too intentional, too purposeful. I was starting to think I might not be alone after all. One evening, as the sun began to set, painting the sky with streaks of red and orange, I heard it again, clearer this time. A voice, carried by the wind, whispering my name. Jacob. I froze. The voice was unmistakable, and yet I could not place it. It wasn't anyone I knew, not a person I recognized. But the voice, something about it was familiar. It tugged at something deep inside me, a forgotten memory, an old feeling I couldn't quite grasp. The wind picked up, swirling the sand in small, localized gusts, but the voice remained, lingering in the air, repeating my name over and over again. The sound wasn't natural. There was a rasp to it, like something old and dry, as though it had been buried beneath the earth for far too long. I stood still, rooted to the spot, trying to rationalize it. It was the wind, I told myself. It had to be. Maybe there was a natural formation of rocks or dunes nearby that was carrying the sound. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The sound had come from nowhere. It wasn't the wind, it was something else. Something that shouldn't be there. The next few days were a blur. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Each night, they seemed to grow closer, filling my head with murmurs and unintelligible words. During the day, the wind picked up with greater intensity, kicking up clouds of sand that seemed to move with purpose. And then, one night, I saw them. The shadows in the distance, figures moving just beyond the edge of my camp. At first, they appeared to be nothing more than silhouettes, shifting with the wind. But as I stared, I realized they were not simply shadows. They were too deliberate, too defined. Figures that walked, that moved as though they had weight, but were still shrouded in darkness. My breath caught in my throat, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to get out of there. But my legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed, caught between the need to flee and the curiosity that pulled me forward. Jacob. The voice came again, this time louder, more urgent. I turned, my eyes scanning the darkness, but there was no one there. No one except the figures in the sand, their outlines faint but unmistakable. I felt a chill spread down my spine. There was no place to run. No way to escape. I wasn't alone. And then, as if the air itself had thickened, the first of the figures moved closer, its form shifting, growing in the moonlight until it was no longer a shadow. It was a figure, tall, thin, with ragged clothing that fluttered against its skeletal frame. Its eyes were black pits, deep and endless, and they fixed on me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. My breath hitched, my mind racing to explain what I was seeing. But there was no rational explanation. There was only the desert. And the voices. And the things that walked in the sand, searching for something. A memory tugged at my mind. A warning my father had once told me, long ago, before I left home. The desert keeps the souls of the lost, Jacob. They don't rest. They never do. I had laughed it off back then. I wasn't laughing now. Jacob. The voice repeated, but it wasn't just one anymore. It was a chorus of whispers, rising and falling like the wind. I could feel them pressing against me, coming closer. I wasn't alone anymore. They were here. And I was about to learn what they wanted. The desert had always been an unforgiving place, but what I was experiencing now was beyond anything I had ever imagined. The whispering voices filled the air around me, growing louder, and the figures in the distance were no longer distant. They were near, too near. I stumbled back, my heart racing as the shadows advanced, moving with an eerie, unnatural grace. The sand beneath my feet felt soft and shifting, like it was trying to pull me down. I couldn't look away from the figure at the front, its black eyes locked on me as though it knew everything about me. A part of me wanted to scream, but no sound came. My throat was dry, and the weight of the air around me seemed to crush any attempts to move. My limbs felt like stone. It wasn't just fear. It was something heavier, something older, creeping into my mind, taking control of my thoughts. "Jacob, come closer." The voice was clearer now, not just a whisper but a command. The air was thick with it, pressing against my skin. I tried to force my feet to move, but they wouldn't obey. The sand around me seemed to vibrate, pulsating with the rhythm of the voices that echoed through the emptiness. I turned, my eyes frantically searching the landscape for something, anything, that would give me an escape. But all I saw was more sand, endless dunes that stretched beyond the horizon. There was no way out. No way to run. Suddenly, the figure at the front of the group stepped forward, its gaunt, skeletal form looming larger as it drew near. The faintest hint of tattered cloth hung from its body, fluttering in the wind like a ghostly flag. It didn't speak anymore, only watched me with those dark, hollow eyes. I could feel the weight of its gaze sinking deep into my soul, a pressure so intense it made my skin prickle. My breath caught in my chest. The voices were everywhere now, swirling around me like a storm of whispers. I couldn't tell if they were speaking to me or to one another. But they weren't speaking words anymore. They were thoughts. "Help us," came a voice, one that seemed to rise above the others, clearer, more desperate. "We are trapped. Help us, release us." It was a voice like mine, like a human voice. But the words felt wrong, distorted, like they came from far away. And yet, they made my heart skip a beat. I knew that voice. I could feel it in my bones. It was like a forgotten memory, a shadow of something I'd once known. "Who are you?" I managed to croak, my throat scraping painfully with the words. My voice sounded small, insignificant compared to the growing cacophony of whispers surrounding me. The figure closest to me finally spoke, its voice low and raspy, like the sound of dry bones grinding together. "We are the lost, the forgotten, those who were left behind." The words hit me like a physical blow, and I stumbled back, my head spinning. The shadows seemed to close in, their forms shifting with every step they took toward me. They weren't human, I realized. Not really. Not anymore. I began to see them for what they truly were, creatures of sand and dust, their bodies broken and twisted in ways that no living thing should be. They had once been people, perhaps, but something had happened to them, something that left them in this twisted, unfinished state, wandering between worlds. The whispers in the wind became a low hum, vibrating in my chest. And with each passing moment, the shadows around me seemed to grow more solid, more defined. They had faces now, pale, sunken faces with eyes that gleamed with an unnatural hunger. Their mouths stretched into grotesque smiles, but the smiles were not kind. They were hungry. Hungry for something. For me? "Please," I whispered, my voice cracking. "What do you want from me?" The figure at the front took another step closer, the air around me thick with an ancient, unbearable presence. Its skeletal hand reached out, its long, bony fingers brushing my cheek with a coldness that made my skin crawl. We want to be free. It didn't need to say more. I understood. They were trapped in this desolate place, caught between worlds. And they needed a way out. The question was, what did I have to do with it? Why had they chosen me? The voices started to chant now, rising in a chorus of unintelligible words, a crescendo of sound that rattled my bones. The desert around me seemed to warp, the sand shifting beneath my feet in a disorienting blur. The sky, too, seemed to pulse, like it was alive, like it was watching. I could feel them, feel their presence all around me, pressing in, suffocating me. They were close now. So close. And that voice, the one that sounded so much like my own, was still calling out. Help us. Help us, Jacob. Please, release us. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I could help them or if I even should. But the voices wouldn't stop. They kept calling my name, begging for release. And the more they called, the more the weight on my chest grew, the more desperate I became. I had to do something. But what? That's when I saw it, something glimmering in the sand, half buried, as though waiting for me to find it. A small, polished stone. I bent down, my hand trembling as I picked it up. The stone was warm to the touch, smooth and glimmering faintly in the moonlight. It was like nothing I had ever seen before, like a piece of something broken, a shard of a world that no longer existed. And that's when I knew. I had to make a choice. I held the stone in my hand, feeling its heat seep into my skin, sending a shiver up my spine. It felt as though it had been waiting for me, calling out to me through the desert's endless silence. The whispers around me seemed to pause for a moment, as if they were holding their breath, waiting for me to make a decision. But what choice did I have? The figures, those lost souls, stood still, their hollow eyes fixed on me. There was no question now. I understood what they wanted. They needed something, and I had no idea if I could give it to them. I could feel the weight of the stone pulling me in, its dark energy coursing through my veins like a poison. Take it. The voice was clearer now, not a whisper, but a command. A voice that was not just in my head, but in the air itself, vibrating with ancient power. I looked up at the figure closest to me, the one that seemed to lead the others. Its face was pale, its features sharp and twisted, as though time itself had stolen its humanity. The air around it shimmered with an unnatural coldness. Help us. It repeated the words like a prayer, its voice dripping with desperation. The others stood behind it, their forms shifting and writhing in the sand like ghosts caught in a storm. They were no longer just shadows, they had become something more, something real, something terrifying. I felt the stone's pull grow stronger. My mind screamed for me to put it down, to turn away and run, but my body refused to listen. There was something in that stone, something that was calling me, something that was tying me to them. Please, we need to be freed. I looked back at the figure. Its mouth opened in a grotesque smile, and I could see the jagged remnants of teeth that had long since rotted away. The air around it crackled, thick with power, and I realized then that the stone was a key. A key to something ancient, something buried beneath the sands. But at what cost? The stone seemed to hum in my palm, its surface pulsing with an eerie light. The whispers swirled around me, louder now, their voices rising in intensity, their words becoming clearer. You are the one who will free us. My pulse quickened, my breath shallow. I could feel the weight of the decision pressing on me, crushing me from all sides. If I released them, what would they become? What would I become? The figure took another step closer, its skeletal hand reaching out towards me. I could see its fingers twitching, longing for something, for the stone. I instinctively stepped back, clutching the stone to my chest. The air around me seemed to grow colder, and I realized then that I was no longer alone. The ground beneath my feet shifted, and I heard a low rumble, like thunder rolling through the earth. The sand began to rise, swirling around me, becoming a violent whirlpool that dragged at my legs. I stumbled, struggling to stay upright, but the wind howled louder, and the figures around me seemed to grow stronger, more real. One of them reached out, its fingers brushing my arm, sending a chill down my spine. Its grip was cold, like ice. I tried to pull away, but it was too strong. The figure's face was inches from mine now, its eyes wide and dark, filled with an emotion I couldn't quite place. You must make the choice. The voice came from deep within the creature, but it wasn't just its voice. It was all their voices, overlapping, merging into one. Release us, and we will grant you power. We will grant you freedom. Power. Freedom. The words echoed in my mind, and for a moment, I was tempted. The power to control, to escape, to leave this hellish place. It would be so easy to give in. But I could feel the darkness in their words. There was no freedom for them, only an endless existence of suffering and regret. I knew what they wanted. They wanted me to release them, but not because they sought peace. They sought vengeance. I tried to pull away from the figure, but it held me tight, its grip unyielding. The sand beneath me was rising faster now, swirling around my legs like a living thing, the desert itself turning against me. I could feel the temperature drop, the air growing heavier with each passing second. I looked down at the stone in my hand, feeling its power thrumming through me. It wanted me to use it. It was alive, in a way. A weapon, a tool, something that could change everything. But at what cost? You don't have to suffer. The words echoed in my mind, pulling me in, tempting me. I could hear the voices of those who had been trapped here for centuries, the souls who had once walked the earth, now nothing more than hollow shells of their former selves. I had to make a choice. A choice that would determine whether I would become one of them or whether I would walk away. The stone pulsed once more, and I made my decision. The decision had been made. There was no going back now. The stone pulsed in my hand, urging me to act. My mind was clouded with fear, confusion, and a growing sense of doom. I had come so far, endured so much, and now it all seemed to culminate in this one moment. Would I free them? Would I let them loose on the world? The figure holding me began to pull me closer. Its skeletal fingers dug into my arm like talons, cold and unyielding. The other spirits swarmed around me, their eyes locked on the stone, their movements quickening, eager. I could feel their presence surrounding me, the weight of their despair pressing down, suffocating me. I tried to speak, to beg for mercy, but the words stuck in my throat. There was no mercy here, only the sharp edge of inevitability. Release us. The whisper came again, louder this time, coming from every direction, echoing in the very air itself. It was no longer a question. It was a demand. I felt the power in those words, a dark and ancient force pushing against my will. The stone was growing hotter in my hand, its surface slick with some sort of unnatural moisture. I could feel the souls of the damned clawing at me, their hunger for release palpable. We are trapped here, lost to time, to the desert, to the wind. The figure's voice had deepened, no longer just a whisper, but a guttural growl that reverberated through the earth beneath us. I looked into its hollow eyes, seeing nothing but the reflection of my own fear. I took a step back, but the desert shifted beneath my feet, the sand rising higher, swirling violently around me. It was as though the world itself was collapsing in on itself. The ground trembled. The wind howled louder, like the scream of some ancient beast. The stone throbbed in my palm, as if it were alive, as if it were feeding on my fear. I turned, looking desperately for any way out, but the desert stretched endlessly before me, an unbroken sea of golden dunes. There was no escape from this place. No escape from them. The stone called to me once more, its power undeniable. In that moment, I understood. I wasn't just holding the stone. The stone was holding me. I could feel its pull deep within my chest, as if it were binding me to something much older, much darker than I had ever imagined. Make the choice. The figure spoke again, its voice dripping with malice, and I realized something terrible. They didn't just want release. They wanted something more. They wanted my soul. The thought gripped me like a vice. My heart raced in my chest, the cold sweat clinging to my skin. The stone's power was suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. I had come to this desert to uncover the truth, but now I saw that the truth was far worse than I had ever feared. This was no simple curse. No mere trick of the wind. The desert itself was alive, a living entity, and the spirits were its twisted servants. And I was about to become one of them. I could feel the stone's influence growing stronger, its power overwhelming. It wanted to consume me, to take everything I was and twist it into something unrecognizable. The whispers grew louder, no longer just voices, but a cacophony, a deafening roar of despair and rage. The ground beneath me cracked, fissures spreading like a spider's web, and the air itself seemed to tremble with anticipation. I knew I had to act. But what was the right choice? If I destroyed the stone, would I destroy them too? Or would they consume me whole? I took a deep breath, my mind racing, and something in me snapped. With one swift motion, I threw the stone into the air, watching as it spun, its surface glowing with an eerie light. The spirits recoiled, their hollow eyes following the stone's flight. It hovered in the air for a moment, as if frozen in time. And then, as if the desert itself had sighed, it fell. The world seemed to slow, the air thick with tension. The ground beneath my feet shifted violently, the sand rising in a swirling cyclone, pulling at my legs, my arms, my very soul. The spirits screamed in unison, their voices a horrifying chorus of anguish. I looked up, my heart pounding in my chest, but the figure was gone. The desert had swallowed them whole, devouring them into the nothingness from which they had come. For a moment, there was silence. I stood in the midst of the storm, gasping for breath, my hands trembling. The whispers were gone. The sand had stopped swirling. The sun above me, which had been obscured by the storm, broke through the clouds, casting its harsh, unrelenting light across the desert. But I could still feel them. The weight of their presence, lingering just beyond the edge of my perception. And I knew, deep in my bones, that they were not truly gone. They had not been freed. They had merely been pushed back into the darkness, waiting for someone else, someone like me, to come along again. And the thought filled me with dread. I took a shaky step back, my mind reeling. The stone was gone, but I knew it had left its mark on me. I had destroyed it, but in doing so, I had unknowingly bound myself to it. The desert had claimed me, and though I might leave, I would never truly escape. I looked one last time at the dunes stretching endlessly before me. The wind had died down, and the silence was deafening. But in that silence, I heard it, the faintest whisper of a voice, barely a breath, carried on the wind. You cannot run. I froze. The whisper was faint, almost imperceptible, but it lingered in my mind like a gnawing ache. You cannot run. I turned in every direction, expecting to see something, anything, but there was nothing. The desert stretched out before me in its vast emptiness, its sand smooth and unbroken. The sun beat down mercilessly, casting long shadows across the dunes. No footprints. No sign of life. And yet, the whisper, the voice, was unmistakable. I pressed my hands against my temples, trying to steady my mind. It's just the wind. It's just the desert playing tricks on me. But even as I thought it, I knew it wasn't true. The whisper had been too clear, too deliberate. It wasn't a trick of the mind, it was a warning. I glanced down at my hands, trembling as they hovered over the sand. The stone was gone, but its presence still lingered in me, like a curse I couldn't shake. The memories of those voices, the voices of the spirits, had burned themselves into my soul. The air around me felt thick, heavy with the weight of their anger, their desperation. I could almost hear their movements in the distance, the faint rustling of sand that carried the imprint of their eternal search. The stone had been destroyed, yes, but in doing so, I had broken the boundary. The spirits had not been freed, they had been unleashed, and now they were following me, waiting for the right moment to claim me. I stumbled back, my legs unsteady, my heart hammering against my chest. I didn't know how far I could run. I didn't know if running would even matter. But I had to try. I began to walk, then jogged, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I made my way across the dunes. The air was dry, burning my throat with each breath, but I couldn't stop. My mind was a whirlwind of panic. I couldn't hear the whispers anymore, but I felt them. They were always there, just on the edge of my awareness, like a shadow trailing behind me. And in the pit of my stomach, I could feel the unmistakable pull of something ancient and malevolent, guiding my every step. I needed to get out. I needed to leave this cursed desert before it consumed me entirely. Hours passed. The sun sank lower in the sky, casting an eerie orange glow over the landscape. My legs ached, and the exhaustion began to cloud my thoughts, but still, I pressed on. Every few moments, I would stop and listen, straining to hear anything that might signal their approach. But the desert remained still, silent, as if it were holding its breath. Maybe they've gone. Maybe it's over. But just as I allowed myself to believe that fleeting hope, I heard it again, the whisper. This time, it was sharper, closer, as if it was right behind me. You cannot escape. I spun around, panic rising in my chest. The desert was empty. Nothing but sand, stretching endlessly into the horizon. My heart thudded loudly in my ears, but the whisper had been so clear. It had been so real. I took another step, then another, but the ground beneath me shifted. I sank, my foot slipping into the sand, and suddenly the earth felt like it was closing in around me, swallowing me whole. I tried to pull my foot free, but the sand clung to me like a wet cloth, dragging me deeper. No, not again. I fought, struggling to free myself, but the harder I pulled, the deeper I sank. The air around me grew colder, the temperature dropping as if the desert itself were growing more alive, more hungry. I could hear them now, the spirits, their voices rising in a deafening chorus, a wail that reverberated through the ground beneath me. It was as if the earth itself were crying out a final warning. I stopped, my body frozen in terror. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The whispers weren't just in my ears now, they were in my mind, in my bones, in my very soul. They were everywhere. They were inside me. We have come for you. I screamed, the sound lost in the howling wind. But there was no one to hear it. The spirits were already here, and I was no longer the hunter. I was the prey. The sand continued to swallow me whole, and I felt the cold fingers of the spirits closing in around me, dragging me down into the depths of the earth. Their faces were now clear, their hollow eyes staring at me from the darkness, their mouths twisted in grotesque smiles. I could feel my body giving in, my consciousness slipping away, but I refused to surrender. Not like this. Not without a fight. But as I struggled to breathe, to think, a thought crossed my mind, a realization so horrible, it made my heart stop. The stone hadn't just bound me to the spirits. It had bound them to me. And as the sand closed over my head, I understood the true horror. The desert wasn't just their prison. It was their hunting ground. And I, now one of them, would never escape. The wild forest. I had been hearing rumors for weeks. In the small, tight-knit community of Willow Creek, Ohio, whispers swirled like the fall leaves that blew through the streets. People were disappearing. At first, it seemed like just another story, another mystery in a town where strange things were often discussed over coffee or beers. But these weren't the usual disappearances. No, these were different. Something far worse was happening. I had recently moved to Willow Creek to escape the noise of the city. The forest that bordered the town had always intrigued me. It was wild, untamed, just the way I liked it. But lately, that same forest had become the focal point of fear. People talked about strange footprints, massive, clawed marks in the earth, and unsettling noises that echoed from the trees at night. The more I heard, the more it unsettled me. I didn't want to believe it. After all, people disappear all the time, don't they? Just because there were strange animal tracks left behind didn't mean anything supernatural. Or at least, that's what I kept telling myself. But then, I started seeing things too. It began on a cool autumn afternoon. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest's edge. I decided to take a walk, clear my mind, get some fresh air. The woods always calmed me, and I needed that peace more than ever. But as I walked deeper into the forest, something felt off. The trees seemed to crowd in closer than usual. The rustling of leaves, usually a calming sound, was now an oppressive blanket of noise. I paused and listened. There was something else beneath it, a faint, rhythmic sound that didn't belong. A slow, steady crunch, like something heavy was moving through the underbrush. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned to look. But all I saw were the trees swaying gently in the wind. Just a deer, I told myself, trying to reassure my racing mind. But the crunching grew louder, and I could feel the air grow heavier. My footsteps faltered as I glanced around. The woods had become unnervingly silent, the usual chorus of birds and insects suddenly gone. My breath caught in my throat. Whatever it was big. And it was close. I took another step, cautiously, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow. That's when I saw it, the tracks. They weren't the usual marks left by deer or squirrels, but something much larger. Long, deep impressions in the soft earth, as if something massive had treaded through. I knelt down, my fingers brushing the dirt. The footprints were wide, elongated, with sharp claws at the tips. They didn't belong to any animal I knew. Suddenly, the crunching noise returned, louder now, closer. I stood up quickly, my heart hammering in my chest. The trees seemed to shift around me, casting eerie, twisted shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. I wasn't alone. Panic surged within me, but my legs didn't move. I couldn't bring myself to run. The sound was all around me now, the heavy thuds of something much larger than any animal I had ever encountered. The forest had turned from a place of refuge to one of terror, closing in around me. And then, I saw them. Two large eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness between the trees. They gleamed like twin orbs, watching me, waiting. A deep, guttural growl resonated from the darkness, sending a chill down my spine. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. My breath caught in my throat, my body rooted to the spot. The eyes didn't blink, they didn't move. They just stared at me. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath, and backed away slowly. My mind raced with explanations. Maybe it's a bear. Maybe it's just a trick of the light. But as I turned to leave, the ground beneath my feet gave a deep, ominous creak, and the growl grew louder. Closer. My pulse quickened, my instinct screaming at me to run. But as I took a step back, I felt a sharp tug at my pant leg. I looked down in horror. Something was dragging itself through the ground, right toward me. I yanked my leg away with all my strength, stumbling backward. The trees around me seemed to grow taller, their branches reaching toward the sky like twisted fingers. The shadows deepened. And the eyes, they were still there, unblinking, unwavering. I ran. Branches slapped against my face as I sprinted, but I couldn't stop. I could hear the heavy footsteps behind me now, too close, too loud. Whatever was out there, it was chasing me. I didn't look back. The forest had become a labyrinth, twisting and turning, the trees shifting as if they had a mind of their own. My legs burned, but I didn't dare slow down. The sound of the creature, whatever it was growing louder, its presence pressing on me from all sides. And those eyes, they were still there, watching, following. I burst out of the woods, my breath ragged, my heart pounding in my chest. The familiar sight of the town's outskirts was a welcome relief. But as I turned, panting and desperate, I heard a final, thunderous roar that shook the very ground beneath me. Something wasn't right. I glanced back one last time, my blood running cold as I saw a massive shape standing just beyond the tree line, its eyes gleaming with hunger. It wasn't over. I couldn't shake the image of those eyes. Even after I reached the safety of the town, the unsettling memory followed me like a shadow. The faces of people walking down the streets, their laughter, their casual conversations, all seemed so distant and unreal. I was trying to rationalize what I had seen in the forest. It had to be some kind of animal, I thought. Maybe a bear, or perhaps a wolf, something large enough to leave those massive prints. But the more I thought about it, the less plausible it seemed. Bears didn't hunt in packs, and no wolf I knew had eyes that glowed like lanterns. I was starting to feel like I was losing my grip on reality, like the forest was slipping through my fingers, like a dream that couldn't be pinned down. The next few days were filled with an odd, suffocating quiet. People avoided talking about the disappearances. The town had fallen into an uneasy routine, as if pretending that nothing was wrong would make the problem go away. But I could feel the tension in the air, thick as fog. I couldn't stop thinking about the forest. It was calling me, pulling me back in. I told myself it was curiosity, the need to understand what had happened. But deep down, I knew the truth. It was fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of the thing that stalked the woods. I had to know what it was. I had to confront it before it drove me mad. I packed a small bag, just enough for a day's trek, and left early in the morning before anyone could stop me. The sun was still low in the sky, casting a pale light over the town as I walked back toward the forest's edge. The familiar path seemed different now, the trees looming taller, their branches twisting like claws overhead. As I entered the woods, a strange stillness settled around me. The usual sounds of wildlife, birds, insects, were gone, replaced by an unnatural silence. It was like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. My heart beat faster as I pressed on, each step feeling heavier than the last. I tried to push down the rising panic, telling myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and every crack of a twig beneath my feet felt like it was amplified, as if the forest itself was listening to my every move. I reached the area where I had seen the glowing eyes. My breath caught as I saw the ground again, still marked by the massive, clawed footprints. They were fresh. The earth was soft here, the imprints deep and clear, like something large had passed through only hours ago. I crouched down, my hand trembling as I traced one of the prints with my fingers. It felt wrong, unnatural. The size of it was impossible. Whatever had left these marks was no ordinary animal. Suddenly, a noise broke the silence, a distant, guttural growl. My heart leapt into my throat. I froze, my eyes darting around, searching for the source. The sound was coming from deeper in the forest, echoing through the trees. It was low, almost too low to be heard, but unmistakable. A flicker of movement caught my eye, and I turned quickly. Nothing. The growl came again, this time closer. My pulse hammered in my ears. I had to leave. The feeling of being haunted, of something ancient and powerful lurking just out of sight, was overwhelming. I turned and began to move swiftly, my steps quickening as panic began to rise in my chest. I was almost to the edge of the forest when I heard it. A snap, followed by a low, guttural hiss. My breath caught in my throat. I turned toward the sound, and for the first time, I saw it. A massive shadow, hulking and dark, moved through the trees with terrifying speed. Its shape was distorted by the thick canopy above, but I could make out its outline, tall, broad-shouldered, with glowing eyes that pierced through the shadows. I stumbled backward, my legs trembling, my mind screaming at me to run. But my body couldn't respond. The creature took a step forward, its enormous form shifting through the trees with an eerie fluidity. Then, it stopped. Its eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment, everything went still. The world around me seemed to fade, and there was nothing left but the weight of its gaze. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. My thoughts were frozen, paralyzed by the terror that gripped me. And then, the creature spoke. It wasn't a voice, not in the way humans speak. It was a sound, deep, guttural, like something alive, but not quite living. The growl reverberated through the air, sending a wave of nausea crashing over me. I took a shaky breath, and for a split second, I thought it was going to attack. But instead, it just stood there, watching me. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, didn't even flinch. It simply stared, as if waiting for something. I didn't wait to find out what. I turned and ran, faster than I ever had in my life, my legs pumping with terror, my breath coming in gasps. I could hear the creature following me, its heavy steps thudding through the forest behind me. The sound was deafening, closer with each passing second. Branches whipped at my face, but I didn't care. I couldn't stop. I couldn't think. I just had to get away. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I broke through the trees and into the open field beyond the forest. I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air, my heart still racing. I didn't dare look back. But I knew it was still out there. And it was waiting. The days that followed were a blur. I didn't tell anyone what had happened in the forest. How could I? How could I explain the terror that still gripped me, the horrifying sight of those eyes locked on mine, the creature that waited in the shadows? No one would believe me. I could hardly believe it myself. But the forest, it was calling me again. Every night, as I lay in bed, I could hear the faintest whispers from the woods, like a soft wind carrying secrets. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw its eyes, those glowing, predatory eyes, staring at me through the trees. It was as if it had branded me, claimed me as its own. The fear was consuming, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, it was always there, just beneath the surface. I knew I couldn't leave it like this. The creature, whatever it was, wasn't going to stop. It had found me once, and it would do so again. I had to confront it. I had to understand what it was, why it was here, and why it was watching me. So, once again, I packed my bag, this time with more than just food and water. I brought a flashlight, a knife, and a sense of resolve I hadn't felt in days. The forest wasn't going to intimidate me. I wasn't going to let it. Not again. The air was thick as I approached the woods. It was early morning, the sky still painted in hues of purple and blue, and the town was silent. Not a soul stirred. It was as if the world had paused, waiting for me to enter the forest again. I could hear the rustling of leaves beneath my feet as I stepped onto the familiar path. The trees loomed overhead, their branches thick with dark shadows. The stillness was suffocating. No birds sang. No insects buzzed. Just the oppressive quiet that seemed to press down on me. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I knew I had to find something. Anything. A clue, a sign that would explain what I had seen and what was still lurking in the shadows. I walked deeper into the forest, my heart pounding with every step. The further I went, the more unnatural it felt. It was as if the air itself was growing heavier, more suffocating. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, the weight of something watching me. And then, I heard it again. The soft rustle of movement, faint at first, like a breeze brushing past my ear. But then, it came again, louder. And then a thud, a heavy footstep, followed by another, closer this time. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath caught in my throat. The growl from before, the same guttural sound, echoed in the distance. It was closer than ever. I could feel the panic rising in my chest. It was here, it was real, and it was getting closer. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands trembling as I clicked it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the forest ahead. The trees stood silent, their twisted branches blocking any view of the path ahead. I knew it was out there. Somewhere. I took a shaky step forward. The light swept over the ground, scanning for any sign of movement. And then, there it was. A fresh set of tracks, bigger than before, the claws leaving deep marks in the soft earth. The prints led off the path and into a dense thicket of trees. My breath caught in my throat as I realized, whatever it was, it had been following me. I swallowed hard, the fear creeping up my spine. But I had come too far now to turn back. I had to know. I had to face it. I pushed through the underbrush, the sound of my footsteps too loud in the otherwise silent forest. The tracks were clearer now, and I followed them deeper into the woods. With each step, the air grew colder, heavier, and the silence grew more oppressive. My pulse quickened, each thud of my heart reverberating in my ears. Then, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The unmistakable sound of branches snapping, something large moving through the trees. I froze, my breath catching in my chest. Slowly, I turned the flashlight toward the sound, my hand trembling. There, just beyond the beam of light, I saw it. A massive figure, crouching low to the ground, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. For a moment, everything was still. The creature's eyes locked onto mine, and I could feel the weight of its gaze, like it was studying me, judging me. It wasn't just any creature. It was something ancient, something primal. Its fur was matted and dark, its massive limbs rippling with muscle. It was almost human, but not quite, a twisted, grotesque parody of something once known. The growl that escaped its throat sent a chill down my spine, a low rumble that vibrated through the air. I didn't move. I couldn't. The creature's eyes held me in place, its gaze like a vice, squeezing the air from my lungs. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. The sound of its movements faded into the distance, leaving me alone in the silent, oppressive dark. I stood there for a moment, too terrified to move, too terrified to breathe. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. The thing, the creature, it was real. It was out there, hiding in the woods, watching. I wanted to run. I wanted to escape. But I couldn't. I was too deep now. The creature had shown itself, and I knew that if I didn't face it now, it would haunt me forever. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my shaking hands, and move forward. The flashlight flickered, and I cursed under my breath, the darkness around me growing thicker, more suffocating. I had come to find the truth. But what if the truth was more terrifying than I could ever imagine? The forest had changed. At first, it was subtle, like the shift from day to night, so gradual you didn't even notice it happening. But now, as I moved through the trees, I could feel it. The air was thicker, the trees taller, their twisted branches more foreboding. The very ground beneath my feet seemed to pulse with a rhythm, a heartbeat that wasn't mine. And I knew, deep down, that it wasn't just the creature that had changed the forest, it was something older, something more dangerous. I had walked deeper into the heart of the woods than I ever had before. Each step felt like a descent into the unknown, like I was moving further from reality and closer to something darker. The sound of my breathing was louder than ever, like the forest was listening to me, waiting. And then, just as I thought I might be losing my mind, I heard it again, the crunch of branches, the growl, the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the underbrush. The creature. It was here. I wasn't ready. I hadn't planned for this moment. But the truth was, there was no more time for planning. I had to face it. I had to confront whatever it was that had been lurking in these woods. If I didn't, it would consume me. I swallowed the lump in my throat and turned my flashlight toward the sound. There, just at the edge of the clearing, I saw movement. The flash of something dark, something massive. The creature stepped into the beam of my flashlight. It wasn't what I had expected. It wasn't just an animal, or even something from the realm of the supernatural. It was something else. The thing had the body of a bear, but the legs were too long, too spindly, like they didn't quite belong. Its fur was matted and damp, clinging to its skeletal form in places. Its face was grotesque, elongated and twisted into something that seemed almost human, yet still far from it. Its eyes, those glowing, predatory eyes, locked onto mine. I felt a jolt of fear shoot through me, but I couldn't look away. Something about the way it stared at me made my body freeze in place. It was as if it were studying me, like it had been waiting for me. I tried to make sense of the creature, but my mind kept slipping, like trying to hold onto water with bare hands. It was too much. Too unnatural. The creature let out a low growl, the sound vibrating through the trees, and took a step toward me. My heart raced. I knew I had to move, but my body wouldn't obey. I felt like I was rooted to the spot, held by the creature's gaze, its presence. My mind was telling me to run, to scream, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed with fear. Another step. Closer now. I could hear its breath, sharp and ragged, like it was hungry. And I realized then, with a sickening certainty, that it wasn't just the forest that had been watching me. The creature itself had been hunting me, waiting for the right moment. A sudden rustling noise broke my trance. I turned, half expecting something else to emerge from the shadows. But when I looked back at the creature, it was gone. Just like that, it had disappeared into the trees, vanishing as quickly as it had come. I didn't know whether to be relieved or terrified. The thing had shown itself, but why had it left? Had it lost interest? Or was it waiting for me to follow? I wasn't sure if I could keep going. I wanted to turn back, to run and never stop. But something inside me knew that wouldn't solve anything. I couldn't let this thing win. Not after everything it had put me through. I had to go deeper. The woods were silent now. But the silence was worse than the growling. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. I moved forward, slowly, cautiously, the flashlight trembling in my hand. With every step, the air grew colder, the shadows deeper. The trees seemed to close in around me, pressing in on all sides. I could feel eyes on me, but when I turned, nothing was there. The rustling of leaves behind me, the distant sound of something heavy moving in the underbrush, it was all growing louder, more persistent. I wasn't alone. Then, I saw it again. The creature was standing just at the edge of the path, its back to me. It was sniffing the air, its massive head moving back and forth, like it was tracking me. My pulse quickened, but I didn't run. I couldn't. I held my breath, watching it, waiting. For a long moment, the creature didn't move, and I almost thought it hadn't seen me. But then, with a sudden, jerky motion, it turned. And it was looking at me again. I didn't know if it had followed me from the beginning or if it was now just circling me, waiting for the right moment to strike. But one thing was certain, the creature was no longer just a shadow in the trees. It was here, and it was real. In that moment, everything that had happened in the past days, the strange sounds, the eerie eyes, the fear I had carried with me, suddenly made sense. This creature wasn't just some animal or some mythical being. It was a force. A force of nature that had been disturbed, and now it was angry. I raised the flashlight in my hand, my fingers shaking, and I took a step back. The creature stepped forward. And that's when I knew I couldn't fight it. I couldn't win. It wasn't just a creature. It was the forest itself. It was the wild, untamable force that had been here long before me. And it would be here long after I was gone. I turned and ran. I didn't stop running. The trees around me blurred into a wall of green and brown, the underbrush clawing at my legs as I pushed through, my breath ragged in my chest. I could still hear it, the heavy footsteps of the creature, too close now, each thud shaking the ground beneath my feet. The trees felt like they were moving with me, their branches reaching out as though they were trying to drag me back. But I didn't stop. I don't know how long I ran. Time had twisted into something unrecognizable. My mind was a blur, and all that mattered was escaping the creature, escaping the forest, escaping the thing that was hunting me. Then, just as my legs began to give out, I saw it, the clearing, the edge of the woods, the way out. I pushed forward with everything I had left, my body screaming, my heart pounding in my ears. The creature was still behind me. I could feel it, but I didn't dare look back. I was too close. I had to make it out. I broke through the trees and into the open space, the moonlight flooding the clearing. For a moment, everything was still. The wind stopped, the world held its breath. I was out. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, my body trembling from the exertion. The silence was deafening, a sharp contrast to the noise that had filled my ears only moments before. I sat there, my hands digging into the dirt, trying to steady myself, trying to convince myself that I was safe. But I knew better. The forest was still alive. The creature, whatever it was still out there. And it wasn't finished with me. I looked around the clearing, trying to gather my bearings, but all I saw were trees. The same trees that had surrounded me before. The same trees that had nearly swallowed me whole. I heard it again, the faint sound of branches snapping. The creature was still out there, watching me, waiting. A wave of dread washed over me. I had escaped the forest, but the forest hadn't let me go. Not yet. I rose to my feet, barely able to stand, my legs like jelly beneath me. The fear that had consumed me earlier was back, stronger than ever. I felt as though I was no longer just a person, no longer a human being with thoughts and fears. I was a part of the forest now, a part of the wildness that had taken hold of me, and it would never let me go. I began to walk, stumbling toward the path that would lead me back to the town. The creature's presence lingered in the air, and I knew that, no matter how far I ran, I would never be truly free. The forest had claimed me, and it would always be a part of me. I could hear it now, the soft rustling behind me, the snap of a twig. The creature was following me. And this time, it wasn't going to let me escape. With each step, the forest seemed to grow darker, the shadows deepening, pulling me further into its grip. I could feel the coldness at the back of my neck, a presence behind me, getting closer. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. I thought of the town, of the people I had known, of the life I had left behind. It seemed like a dream now, a memory that had already begun to fade. I didn't know if I would ever make it back. All I knew was that the forest was waiting, and I was its prey. The Cult of Shadows. It all started with a letter. I wasn't sure why I even kept it. Maybe it was the mysterious air about it. The handwriting was strange, a flowing script that almost seemed to dance on the paper. But it was the words that truly caught my attention. Join us, and you'll find the truth. At that point in my life, truth was something I had been desperately searching for. I had just moved to Georgia, trying to escape a past that seemed to follow me like a shadow. The small town I found myself in felt isolated, almost forgotten by time. Life was slower here, but not necessarily easier. In fact, there was something about it that made me uneasy. The people, the town itself, it felt like something was hidden beneath the surface. Then, I received that letter. I had no idea who it was from. It was addressed to me by name, but I hadn't given it to anyone. There was no return address, just a cryptic invitation. For weeks, I thought about it, the words pulling at me like a magnet. Who wouldn't be intrigued? An invitation to uncover something hidden, something deep. I told myself it was just curiosity, but the idea of something more, something that felt so elusive, began to consume me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was on the verge of discovering something monumental. Eventually, I responded. The meeting place was set for midnight. An old barn just outside of town, surrounded by thick woods. I hadn't seen it before, but after doing some research, I realized it had been abandoned for years. When I arrived, the place was quieter than I expected, and the air felt unnaturally still. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting eerie shadows that seemed to stretch longer than they should. I stood there for a moment, uncertainty creeping in. The door of the barn creaked open slowly, and a man stepped out from the shadows. His presence was imposing, his figure tall and thin, like a specter in the dark. His eyes gleamed with a strange intensity, and he didn't say a word. He only motioned for me to follow him inside. The interior of the barn was dimly lit, the faint flicker of candles illuminating the faces of the other people gathered around. They were all strangers, their eyes locked onto me with a kind of quiet, expectant focus. It was unsettling, but I pushed the feeling down. I wanted to understand. I wanted to know what was so special about this place, this community. These people, who somehow seemed to live by a different rhythm, a different set of rules. The man, who I later learned was called Jacob, stepped forward, his voice a soft, smooth whisper that sent chills down my spine. "We have been waiting for you," he said. And just like that, I was pulled in. The ritual had begun. I had never been much of a believer in the supernatural, and I still didn't fully understand what drove me to visit the group in the first place. Maybe it was the loneliness of my life in Georgia. Maybe it was the allure of something different, something exciting. Whatever it was, it started with a simple invitation. It was a Saturday evening when I first heard about them. I had just moved into the small town of Greenfield, Georgia, looking to start fresh after a rough year in the city. The people here were quiet, reserved, but friendly enough. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful for someone like me, who was used to the constant buzz of city life. I was at a local bar when I met Luke. He was a stranger at first, but there was something about him that seemed different. He was charismatic in a way that made it hard to look away. His words flowed like a river, effortlessly drawing people in. But when he spoke to me, there was something deeper in his eyes, something unsettling, but captivating. "You're new here, aren't you?" he asked, leaning in close, his voice low. I nodded. "Yeah, just moved in. Trying to find a place to fit in." "You're not the only one," he said with a slight smirk. "We've got a group. We meet in the woods sometimes. You might want to join us." I hesitated. There was something in his tone that made my gut twist with unease, but I couldn't resist. The idea of belonging somewhere, to anyone, felt too tempting to ignore. Sounds interesting, I said, trying to sound casual. Luke smiled. I'll send you the details. Just show up. You'll see. Later that night, I received a message from an anonymous number. Come to the edge of the forest at midnight. We'll be waiting. I almost didn't go. Part of me screamed that it was a bad idea, but another part, curiosity, maybe, compelled me to follow through. I needed to do something, anything, to break out of the rut I was in. By the time midnight came, the moon was hidden behind a blanket of clouds. The woods outside the town seemed dark and dense, their silhouettes looming like ancient giants. I parked my car at the edge of the forest and made my way down a narrow path. Every step felt like a breach of some unspoken boundary. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath my feet. As I walked further, I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The woods were silent in a way that felt unnatural. No animals, no birds. Just stillness. Then, I saw them. There was a clearing ahead, lit by flickering torches. Figures stood around a large stone altar, their faces hidden beneath dark hoods. At the center of the group stood Luke, his face illuminated by the torchlight. He looked at me, and his smile was wide, almost too wide. You made it, he said, his voice echoing in the still night. I stood frozen, unsure if I should step forward or run back to my car. But something about the way they all looked at me, like they were expecting me, like I belonged, made my heart race with anticipation. Luke gestured for me to join them. Don't be shy, he said. We've been waiting for you. I walked into the circle, my steps tentative. The others didn't speak, but they seemed to welcome me with their silent stares. It felt like an initiation, like I was about to be led into a secret world. I wasn't sure what I had expected, but it certainly wasn't what came next. The air seemed to grow colder, and the shadows around the clearing deepened. One of the figures stepped forward, their voice like a whisper carried by the wind. Tonight, we honor the one who watches from the shadows, the keeper of the dark. His gift is power, but it requires a price. A chill ran down my spine. I tried to make sense of the words, but nothing about the ritual made any logical sense. The others moved closer, and suddenly I was surrounded. Luke's hand rested on my shoulder, and he leaned in, his breath warm against my ear. You're one of us now, he whispered. You're here to become part of something much bigger than you can imagine. Before I could respond, the figure at the altar raised their hands, and the air seemed to shift. The shadows around us thickened, twisting and coiling like living things. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized something was wrong, deeply, terribly wrong. But it was too late to leave. The ritual began. And from that moment on, nothing in my life would ever be the same. I woke the next morning with a heavy feeling in my chest. The sunlight streaming through my window felt foreign, like it didn't belong to this new, strange world I'd stumbled into. My mind raced with memories of the night before. The ritual, the chanting, the shadows. It all felt like a dream, but my body ached as if I had been awake for hours, trapped in some surreal nightmare. I shook the thought away, trying to convince myself that it wasn't real, that it was just a strange, isolated incident. But deep down, I knew something had changed. Something inside me had shifted, like a door opening to something I couldn't understand. I forced myself to get out of bed and go about my day. Work at the construction site seemed dull compared to the events of last night, but even there, I couldn't escape the nagging feeling that I was being watched. The air was thick with tension, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Every time I looked around, I half expected to see someone from the group, their eyes hidden beneath those dark hoods, observing me from the shadows. The day dragged on, and just when I thought I might collapse from the exhaustion of trying to ignore the growing unease, I received another message from Luke. Meet us again tonight. Same place. You won't want to miss this. I stared at the screen for a long time before typing a response. I wasn't sure why, but I found myself drawn to the idea of going back, to finding out more about what I had become a part of. Even though every instinct screamed at me to turn away, I couldn't stop myself. Something was pulling me deeper, like an invisible force that I had no control over. That night, I returned to the same clearing, the woods feeling even darker than before. The torches were already lit, their flickering flames casting eerie shadows across the ground. The group was gathered in the same formation, their faces still hidden beneath hoods. But this time, there was something different. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, like something was about to happen. Something big. Luke was waiting for me at the center of the circle. He smiled when he saw me, his expression almost knowing, as if he had been expecting me all along. Good, you're here, he said, his voice calm but with an edge of something else, something ancient. Tonight, you'll see. I didn't have time to ask what he meant before the others began to chant, their voices rising in unison. It was a low, rhythmic sound that vibrated in the air, settling deep in my bones. I could feel it in my chest, like the beat of a distant drum echoing through the woods. The shadows around us seemed to grow deeper, moving in unnatural ways. They were no longer just shapes, but things, alive, sentient. I wanted to step back, to run, but I couldn't. My feet felt glued to the ground. The more I tried to move, the more I felt the weight of something pressing down on me, as if the very forest itself was holding me in place. Then, something broke through the darkness. A figure, tall, twisted, and shadowy, emerged from the trees. Its form was cloaked in darkness, its features impossible to discern. But I could feel it watching me, its gaze heavy and cold. The air around me grew colder, and I shivered despite the warmth of the night. Luke stepped forward, his voice barely above a whisper. This is what we serve, he said, his eyes locked on the figure. This is the Keeper. The figure raised its arms, and the shadows around us began to move, swirling and twisting like a storm. I felt a strange pull, as if I were being drawn toward it, pulled into its darkness. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body refused to listen. The chanting grew louder, faster. The others around me began to sway, their movements hypnotic, synchronized. It was as if they were no longer human, their eyes empty and distant, focused solely on the figure in the center of the clearing. Join us, Luke said softly, his voice filled with an almost reverent awe. Become one with the darkness. Let it consume you, and you'll understand the power we wield. I wanted to scream, to tear myself away, but I couldn't. The figure's presence was overwhelming, suffocating. My thoughts began to blur, as if I were losing control of my own mind. The shadows whispered to me, their voices the low hum in the back of my head. You belong to us now. And then, in an instant, everything changed. The Keeper extended its hand toward me, and the shadows surged forward, enveloping me in an inky blackness. I felt like I was falling, drowning in the darkness, unable to escape. My lungs burned for air, my body frozen in place, unable to move or scream. The last thing I saw before everything went black was Luke's smile, stretched wide and filled with something that wasn't quite human. And I knew then that there was no turning back. I had crossed a line, and whatever was on the other side, it was waiting for me. I woke up in a cold sweat, the smell of damp earth heavy in my nostrils. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a moment, I wasn't sure where I was. The last thing I remembered was the shadows, those dark, suffocating tendrils that had wrapped around me, pulling me into some unknown depth. I rubbed my eyes, trying to make sense of the confusion swirling in my head. It wasn't just a dream. No, I felt it deep within my bones. The cold, the shadows, the overwhelming presence of the keeper, it had all been real. I was in the woods, lying on the ground near the ritual site. The torches were still flickering, casting their eerie glow over the clearing. The group was gone. The sounds of the forest had returned to their usual quiet hum, but something felt off. There was a silence, a heavy, almost oppressive quiet that hung in the air. I pushed myself up, my head spinning. My fingers trembled as I touched my forehead, expecting to find blood or some sign of the struggle I had gone through. But there was nothing, just sweat and dirt, as if I had simply fallen asleep. But I hadn't. I knew I hadn't. I stumbled to my feet, my legs unsteady beneath me. Every part of me screamed to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But deep down, I knew I couldn't. There was something drawing me back, something that felt both terrifying and irresistible. I turned and began to walk through the woods, not sure where I was going, but certain that I couldn't stay here. The trees loomed above me, their twisted branches casting long shadows on the ground. It felt like I was being watched, like there were eyes in the darkness, following my every move. I tried to shake the thought away, but it clung to me. You're not alone, I thought. They're still here, watching. I stumbled out of the woods and onto a small dirt road that led back to town. The air felt different now, charged with a sense of dread that I couldn't explain. Every passing car seemed to flicker in and out of focus, their headlights casting long, twisted shadows across the pavement. I quickened my pace, not daring to look back, afraid that the figures from the woods might be following me. As I reached my apartment, I felt a brief moment of relief. The door slammed shut behind me, and I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. My mind raced, replaying everything I had seen, everything I had felt. It didn't make sense. It couldn't. But I knew one thing for sure. Whatever had happened in the woods that night, it wasn't over. I tried to sleep, but the nightmares came fast and fierce. I saw the shadows again, creeping along the walls, stretching and twisting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. I heard the chants, faint whispers that echoed in the back of my mind. Join us. You belong to us. I woke up to the sound of my phone vibrating. I glanced at the screen, half expecting it to be Luke. But it wasn't. It was a message from an unknown number. We see you. We know what you've become. You can't escape. My blood ran cold. I stared at the message, my hands shaking. How did they know? Who were they? I wanted to delete the message, to forget about it, but my thumb hovered over the screen, frozen in place. Another vibration broke the silence, and another message appeared. It's only a matter of time before you come back. It's already begun. I threw the phone down onto the table, panic flooding my chest. I couldn't breathe. My heart was racing as I stood up and paced around the room. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that something had changed. Since that night in the woods, I had felt different. I had felt the shadows crawling beneath my skin, watching me. I couldn't escape them, couldn't escape the feeling that something was always lurking, waiting. I couldn't stay here. I had to get out, to leave this town, to leave everything behind. But there was nowhere to run. The shadows were everywhere, and the keeper's presence had already taken root in my mind. I had been marked. No matter where I went, they would follow. That evening, I went to the construction site, hoping that the normalcy of work would ground me. But it didn't. As I descended into the tunnels beneath the city, the air felt thicker than usual, damp and suffocating. The lights flickered as I walked deeper into the maze of dark corridors. The others had already gone home for the day, but I remained, hoping the solitude would bring clarity. But the silence didn't bring peace. It only made everything worse. I could feel the shadows crawling up the walls, whispering in the dark corners. I thought I heard something in the distance, scratching, tapping. Something was moving. I turned, my breath catching in my throat as I saw something dart across the tunnel ahead of me. A shape. Small, dark, and fast. It couldn't be. It had to be my imagination. But then I heard it again, the scurrying sound, louder this time. I took a step back, my heart racing as I strained to listen. It wasn't a rat. It was something bigger, something that should not have been down here, something with a hunger I could feel in the pit of my stomach. The sound grew louder, closer, and before I could react, something brushed against my leg. I screamed and stumbled backward, my eyes wide with terror. And then I saw them. A pair of glowing eyes, reflecting the dim light from above. They glimmered in the darkness, like two cold stars, watching me from the shadows. I froze, unable to move, unable to speak. The shadows were not just in my mind. They were real. And they were coming for me. The creature emerged from the darkness, its silhouette growing larger with each passing second. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural intensity, casting an eerie light on the damp walls around me. My breath hitched in my chest as it took another step forward, its movement fluid but unsettling, like something that didn't belong in this world. I tried to move, but my legs refused to cooperate, frozen in fear. The air in the tunnel had grown colder, more oppressive. I could feel the creature's presence closing in on me, its breath hot and foul, even though I couldn't see its full form. I had to get out. I had to run. With a burst of adrenaline, I finally turned, sprinting down the tunnel. The echo of my footsteps reverberated through the narrow space, but it felt like the darkness itself was chasing me, its breath just inches behind. I could hear the skittering sound again, the soft, rapid patter of claws against the ground, growing louder, closer. I didn't dare look behind me. I could feel its eyes burning into my back, but I pushed myself harder, every muscle screaming in protest. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of decay, of something foul and ancient. I could taste the fear on my tongue as it rose in my throat, choking me. The tunnel ahead seemed to stretch on forever, but the flickering light of the exit was still visible in the distance. I just needed to reach it. But the sound of the creature was right behind me now. It wasn't just the clicking of its claws anymore. It was a low growl or rumbling vibration that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. It was hunting me, and there was no escape. I glanced back briefly, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The creature was massive, its body hunched and malformed, a grotesque monstrosity covered in matted fur. Its arms were too long, its legs too short, and its face. I couldn't make out all the details, but I saw the sharp, jagged teeth glistening in the dim light. It was grinning at me, a wide, twisted grin that stretched across its face, exposing rows of razor-sharp teeth. My pulse raced as I turned back, focusing on the flickering light at the end of the tunnel. The exit. I pushed myself harder, my feet barely touching the ground as I ran faster than I ever had before. But the growl grew louder, the sound of claws scraping against the floor echoing through the darkness. Then I felt it. A sharp pain in my leg, something like a searing, burning grip that sank deep into my flesh. I screamed, stumbling forward as I tried to pull away. It was the creature's claws, digging into my skin, pulling me back into the abyss of the tunnel. I kicked and thrashed, but its grip was too strong. My vision blurred with the intensity of my fear, my body growing weaker with every desperate tug. No. No, no, no. I screamed in my head. I can't die here. With one last burst of energy, I jerked my leg free, the pain nearly overwhelming me as I forced myself forward. The light of the exit was so close now. It was within reach. I ran. The creature was still behind me, but I couldn't let myself stop. I was almost there. I felt its breath on my neck. I could hear it snarling, could feel the ground shaking beneath me as it lunged forward. One more step. Just one more. And then, freedom. I burst through the exit, tumbling into the open air of the city streets. My body hit the ground, the gravel digging into my skin. I gasped for breath, my heart pounding so loudly that it drowned out everything else. The tunnel behind me was silent, but I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. I knew it was still there, waiting, just out of sight. The fear coursed through me, paralyzing every muscle in my body. I scrambled to my feet, my legs still throbbing with pain. I had to get away from this place, from whatever the creature was, from whatever the tunnels had become. I looked around, disoriented, and saw a street lamp flickering in the distance. I started walking toward it, but my mind kept replaying the sounds from the tunnel, the growl, the scratching, the whisper of claws against the stone. The thought of the creature's eyes haunted me, its twisted grin seared into my memory. I felt a hand on my shoulder. I whipped around, expecting to see one of the workers from the site, but instead, I found Luke standing there, his expression cold, his eyes dark. He wasn't alone. There were others with him, figures in dark clothing, their faces obscured by hoods. They moved silently, almost as though they were part of the shadows themselves. Luke's eyes met mine, and I saw something in them that made my blood run cold. It was like a recognition, a shared understanding. "You shouldn't have left," he said, his voice low, almost apologetic. "You can't run from it." I felt the ground beneath me shift, as if the very earth was responding to his words. My breath caught in my throat. The shadows were closing in. I had made a mistake. There was no escape. I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. It felt like my body was moving without my permission, like I was being pulled, drawn back toward the darkness. The keeper's voice echoed in my mind once more, "You belong to us." I closed my eyes, unable to stop the tears that came. There was no going back. I stumbled backward, the cold fingers of terror gripping my chest as Luke and the others advanced. Their faces remained hidden beneath the shadowed hoods, but I could feel their eyes on me, burning with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. It was as if the very ground beneath me was pulling me closer to them, to the shadows that seemed to grow darker with every passing moment. Luke's face remained expressionless, but there was a flicker of something, guilt, perhaps, before he spoke again. "It's not your fault," he said softly. "You didn't understand what you were getting into. But you're here now. You belong with us, like the others." The others. My mind raced, trying to make sense of his words. What did he mean? Who were these people? And what was I supposed to do now? "You don't have a choice anymore," Luke continued, his voice now edged with something darker, something that sent a chill straight through my bones. "The tunnels have already claimed you." I could feel the weight of his words settle on my chest. It was as if a curtain had been pulled back, revealing the truth that had been hiding all along. The strange, unnerving events that had been happening since I started working on this site, the whispers in the tunnels, the shifting shadows, the unease that never seemed to leave me, it wasn't just a coincidence. It was all part of something much larger. Something I had been pulled into without even realizing it. I tried to step away, my feet dragging in the dirt, but Luke's hand shot out, grabbing my arm with a strength that belied his calm demeanor. His grip was like iron, and I felt a jolt of panic shoot through me. "You can't leave," he said, his voice low and forceful. "Not now. The Keeper won't allow it." The Keeper. The name echoed in my mind like a distant warning bell. The words I had heard in the tunnels, the feeling that I was being watched, it all clicked into place. Suddenly, I realized what had been happening. The creatures in the tunnels, the darkness that had seemed to grow and consume everything around me, it wasn't just some wild hallucination. It was real. And worse, it had been manipulating me from the very start. The shadows around me seemed to twist, as if they were alive, swirling with a life of their own. I felt something move within them, something ancient, something powerful. The air grew thick, oppressive, and the very atmosphere seemed to close in around me. My heart pounded in my chest, but I couldn't look away. I couldn't tear my eyes from Luke's expressionless face, from the other figures standing behind him, watching silently. I knew I had made a mistake in coming here, in trusting them. I knew now that I was not just dealing with some twisted cult or a dark, twisted force. I was facing something much worse, something that had been waiting, watching, and now it was ready to claim me. A figure stepped forward from the shadows, taller than the rest, its form impossibly long and stretched, like a silhouette carved from darkness itself. Its eyes glowed with an eerie red hue, cold and unblinking. It was the creature from the tunnels, the thing I had run from. But now, it was here. The Keeper. It stepped closer, its every movement sending a ripple of dread through my entire body. Its eyes never left mine, and I could hear its breath, deep and labored, as it inhaled the air around me. "You tried to escape," the Keeper's voice rumbled, low and guttural, like the sound of shifting stone. "But the tunnels are never truly empty. You can't outrun what you've become." I felt my knees weaken, but I forced myself to stay upright, my chest tightening with every word the Keeper spoke. There was no escape. The realization hit me like a blow to the chest. The tunnels weren't just some labyrinth of underground space. They were a prison, a trap, and now it was clear that I had been its prey all along. The Keeper had watched me, had seen me as a target, waiting for the right moment to draw me in. "You are ours now," the Keeper said, its voice sending a shiver through my entire body. "You will serve. You will follow." Luke stepped forward, his hand still gripping my arm. He looked at me, but his expression had changed. The warmth and familiarity I had once seen in his eyes were gone, replaced with something colder, something more dangerous. "You're part of this now," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the heavy, pulsing silence. "There's no turning back." And then I understood. I had been marked the moment I stepped into those tunnels, the moment I felt the cold shiver down my spine when I first heard the whispers. I had already become part of something much darker, something that was impossible to escape. As the keeper's tendrils reached out for me, I closed my eyes, accepting the fate that was now mine. The darkness had already consumed me, and there was no running from it anymore. I could hear Luke's voice in the distance, as if from far away, whispering the same words the keeper had spoken. "You belong to us." And then, the world went dark. Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.